Yeah,
Being
2
silly.
o'clock.
Yeah.
Solidity practice for all levels.
It was. Yeah. Yeah. We'll see. Take it away, Griff.
Yeah, self-sovereign identity is about to start. That's going to be good. And supporting open source projects will be a really interesting one. It's only half an hour. I wish I had more time, honestly. Well, it's not mine. It's Scott. Scott is going to push it. And then we're going to flow into open source culture. So I imagine we'll have like, we might let the supporting open source projects go a little longer, but we'll see. And then why decentralized data is important. That'll be an interesting one. That'll be TJ, or sorry, Jay. I used to call him TJ back in the DAO chat rooms back in the day. And then decentralized commerce. That'll be Swarm City coming in strong. I bet they just like show everyone how to buy drugs online with their application. And then decentralized justice. That's like the furthest away from blockchain that we have in this. Yeah. It'll be Lorelei talking restorative justice. And then Chavi's coming strong with the anonymous voting at 6 o'clock. Yep. Oh, and then actually, it's not on the schedule, but we have someone coming. The Validity Labs are going to do a chat about anonymous messaging, gossip protocols. So yeah. Well, you guys ready to get started? You're down, right? So this first talk is self-sovereign identity. Jordi is in an Uber, so he's probably going to be here in about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. But no, I think we should start without him because 15 minutes is, he said 20, so we'll see, you know. But who wants to jump in the panel first? Do you guys want to jump in? Yeah, it's going to be a panel, but it's like a rotating panel, so anyone can sit down and ask a question up front, and then yeah, 4 chairs. Yeah, well, yeah, we'll probably throw in a second, a fifth chair if if more people want to show up. Do you want to take a seat? You want to jump in to start? There it is. Look at that. Let's see. Oh yeah, let's do add the fifth chair. Tony, are you going to sit down? Excellent. Okay, so Chris, we're rolling. We're live. So, self-sovereign identity. Why do we need? Isn't Facebook doing a great job? Why do we need identity? Like we have ID cards, we have, Facebook and Google and all these other Amazon. Like everybody has a rating system. Why do we need to decentralize this at all?
First off, I think you're touching on the exact problem is that we have all this stuff and it's all separate. So it's, for example, you have your Facebook identity and it works on Facebook. It works on some other websites because they kind of hijack the thing. But the stuff, for example, you do with the Google account is not going to transfer. And all those things are in separate, in separate silos. And the second problem is also they're completely dependent on the people giving you these identity systems, on Facebook giving you this identity, which can be revoked at any time, which kind of doesn't make sense for an identity. Like your identity stays the same no matter what. And that's the goal. It's to give you something, to give you an identity around which you can organize maybe your name or pseudonyms, different identifiers. Then you can have claims about yourself, like what people say about you, what you say about yourself, different documents. Being able to prove these in like privacy respecting way, using like for example zero knowledge proofs, and having these go with you basically everywhere on the web, on the internet, so that your identity is a constant, and then you just interact with websites and applications. I mean, that's how I see it. If you probably it's still like something we're working on. So as a whole space. So if you have different conception of it, go ahead.
Yeah, furthermore, I think it's a matter of control of who is owning your data. So besides that, you're not sure what they're doing with your personal information. They're linking lots of inputs of you. So the point is that you need to know that you own your own personal data and not third parties, because it doesn't make sense because furthermore they're using to commercial interests. So you need to understand that the regulations will not protect you completely from that. There are interest in having you, giving you access to remove this information, and but still I'm sure they're lying. They are not completely removing anything. So how can you know? How can you know that you really are able to erase your information? That you're able to control what information they are having about you? So it's I think it makes no sense that to rely on third parties on that. You need to be in control of that, and you make sure your privacy is guaranteed by design.
Yeah, I have a lot of personal experience with that. In the last couple months, I actually got deleted from Facebook. I had a full account. I was organizing a Burning Man camp. I had lots of things going on. And I also happen to be admin for Crypto News Group, which is like Omar Bam's crypto news channel. And for some reason, without telling us, they deleted the channel and they deleted all of the admin's Facebook accounts. I have no response for why, but everybody who was in a message with me, they deleted all of my messages, right? It's like they erased my existence on Facebook. And I mean, everyone's like, why don't you get a new Facebook? I'm like, fuck Facebook. Fuck those bastards. If they, it was very useful to interact with my friends and family, obviously. They really have a hold on, but I don't want it, and then I don't have access to any of the friends that I have. I have no idea how to even get that information. They won't respond to me. So that's just gone. And then just the other day, about do they really delete this data? Our YouTube got hacked for Giveth, and we lost all of our videos. Luckily, we know people, right? And we were able to call a friend at Google who actually recovered all of our videos. So that's great news. But it's like, oh, wait, I thought they were deleted, right? And normal people actually can't get them back, okay? I'm just lucky I brought a really cool guy to Burning Man, and, he was able to hook us up. So, this privileged access to your identity, right? These large organizations, if you know somebody, oh, yeah, you're in. But otherwise, no. And also, by the way, this format, there's an empty chair there for a reason. So if anyone wants to come sit down and talk about identity, dive in.
Yeah, on the kind of personal data side, I mean, the personal data you kind of leave all around on the internet is your digital self, just split up across different silos, different places. But on the question of control, it's also data is really important. But to give another example, which illustrates another use case for identity, for this self-sovereign identity, is to have something that's not dependent on the powers that be, on the government or the place where you live. Because refugees, for example, they have to leave their country, and then they're basically left with often nothing and no trace of their official existence. And that's a very, very hard problem then for them to actually arrive somewhere else and state, oh, I'm this person, I was born this year, I have proof, now I can start a new life. If we manage through these decentralized systems to actually create an identity system that's not dependent on your country, on your government, that's so much more resilience and power to the individual, and it's so important in these crisis situations as well.
Yeah, so well, you can decide to create identities on blockchain. I think it's a huge opportunity to do that, but still maybe you need some claims, some that organizations made upon you.
Yeah.
So in the end, somehow you need third parties to claim something about you, so you can prove to another one.
Yeah, on the refugee example, usually these people had an identity in their home country. It's just when they flee or when the government gets tyrannic or overtaken, it just either they can't take it with them or it just gets erased because they don't have control over it. But if it was if it's stored in a decentralized system, they actually control the claims for the birth certificate, for example, they actually control it.
Something like building unstoppable identities, right? So once you have your identity, and nobody can do anything about that. You should decide to be able to destroy it or revoke or do whatever you want with that. But the issue is that you're self-sovereign of your identity in terms of what's happening with that. So if you keep some claims or you're able to receive some information, and maybe claims, it's not well, the point is that somebody's claiming something about you. Maybe the claim is will disappear, but in the end you are able to maintain your own identity.
Are you jumping in? Yes, he's jumping in.
Yeah, I often think just what you said there, that there's a claim of perhaps a name, date of birth, there's data like that. But I sometimes think about what does sort of I guess they call it a web of trust, what does that look like when people and their networks, who they know, and more so I think about the interactions between the people, and that forms who they are. That if you've gone and worked with a certain number of people and you've got, I mean, it comes down to reputation system a little bit as well. That if you've worked with different people and you have those interactions, that contributes to who you are. And then I think back to the Ubuntu philosophy that a person is a person through other people. So immediately you don't need a centralized authority if you can have just good interactions with people, and that puts you in good standing. And yeah, but then corruption of that's another story. Any other thoughts on that?
So this idea of a self-sovereign identity system is obviously very interesting, but how soon can we have a viable proof of concept that ordinary people can start to use to make claims about themselves and to accumulate? Okay.
There's another conference going on right now called IIW, which has been going on for about 20 years. Internet Identity Workshop goes on typically out in California, run by a woman called Kalia Young, otherwise known as Identity Woman. The Sovereign Foundation is going on, has applications right now with regards to self-sovereign identity, as well as Uport is probably the other primary one, as one of the consensus family. But the stuff is available right now.
So is there an effort going on to connect these various different groups around the world, IDEN3 here and Giveth and W and so on and Uport, because there's a lot of useful knowledge and experience being discovered by each of these groups, but they should be sharing it.
My sense is there's probably a little bit of islands, not intentional. There was another really good conference back at the beginning of September, I think, called My Data, which is based out of Finland, and it's all around, personal data, and some very, very good conversations. It was a very blended conference of technical, design, business, and legal, which so has a very different flavor compared to what we're at here today. So it's probably places where people, there are individuals here, I think, that have crossed both areas, but it's making those connections. So something like this is important because it helps make connections that then hopefully we can get that conversation going.
So one of the things that I'm very keenly aware of is that using an open public blockchain to store or preserve censorship-resistant access to an identity system is vitally important, because the moment one starts to move away from open permissionless blockchain, then you get back into the whole system of centralized parties controlling and censoring. So my question is, to what extent are these other initiatives that you're aware of committed to using open permissionless blockchain?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm Joachim, I'm based here in Berlin, and I work on identity for quite a while. And just referring to your first question, so there is actually two initiatives that really drive the standardization, so which the most prominent identity projects are involved in. The one is the Decentralized Identity Foundation that works on the DID standard. And then there is the W3C verifiable credential group. And just yesterday, actually, it was an initiative of the German Blockchain Association. We published a paper on self-sovereign identity. And what this paper tried to do is basically to summarize and describe the common denominator that all these projects have. And the good thing is that we just didn't write it by our own, but it's like really peer reviewed by all the major projects, including people from Kalia to Peter from Web3 Foundation to Markus Manu Sporni and many others. And one word or one thought about like blockchain and identity. So the ideal identity is actually blockchain agnostic, because you don't want to make your identity dependent on any one network, because then you move towards decentralization again. So you want to have an identity that is truly generated just, you know, with you on your device, and then you can interact with several backends, and that needs not to be limited to a single backend. It really can be various backends, and even you can have use cases where you mix different backends. And on the blockchain itself, it's highly recommendable to not store any data. So this is just a trust anchor, so to say, or that you use basically the access to a blockchain for any use case to trigger a smart contract, etc., etc.
In terms of
I don't know if is everyone are you familiar with the Zuko's triangle? Okay, so I'm gonna explain. Basically, the thing that a blockchain solves is a problem introduced by Zuko from Zcash, but like in the early 2000s, when he was working on how can you create like identifiers for websites, like objects or people that are both that are decentralized, secure, and human readable. And he postulated at the time that these three properties could not be achieved at the same time. You could only choose two. For example, if you want something that's decentralized and secure, that means like no one can steal it. You generate a public and private key. The thing is, that's not really human readable. If you want something that's human readable, there needs to be a mechanism through which, if I say, for example, I'm Irvin, if I take as an identity like Irvin, I need to make sure like no one else takes the same identity. But it's very easy because it's human readable. So usually it was a centralized entity that provided this security by making sure nobody else took this name. And well, I think you see where I'm going. The blockchain, a blockchain solves this problem by guaranteeing the security in a decentralized context, by making sure that once an identifier has been taken, it's not going to be like taken again by someone else. It's unique.
Yes, I agree. That's one of the brilliant innovations that the blockchain, public permissionless blockchains make possible. The problem I can see is that if we've got different blockchains with different public-private key pairing algorithms, different elliptic curves, and potentially in the future we move away from elliptic curves to be quantum resistant, this is going to pose a significant challenge for maintaining compatibility and upgradability and backwards compatibility of key management. Anybody thinking about that?
So in terms of like how identity should be structured, you were talking also earlier about different like islands and different projects doing things separately. The thing to remember is W3C has introduced a standard called the DID for decentralized identifiers, and you have associated decentralized identity documents. And then you have further standards down the way. But the way I see it, like very simply, it could be like you have for each different network, you have different public and private key depending on what they implement. But your DID, as they call it, is always the same, and you can just tie it to the key on this network. So this is, and then you have a resolution system, for example, to find the related documents on IPFS or something. And this ensures that you have this, the idea is the same everywhere. And it's kind of like the layer of abstraction above any specific blockchain. And that's like really the basis for creating this identity system around which you can then add your personal data through this resolution thing.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're totally right, and I think what you're painting there is like a risk that we will face, and we are creating a standard now, but will the standard work in the future? And this is actually what we also pointed out in the paper. So right now we are basically in a competitive free environment where there's no real market for decentralized identity, so all the projects are kind of friendly. And but further down the line, it's a risk. So we need to really support this open standards and see that we create like a governance structure around this, that it's also kept that way.
Yeah, I would like to think that we can build a reputation system on top of a sovereign identity system, and that reputation can be tokenized so that there can be value that accrues with reputation, and an individual could have many different sovereign identities, each building their reputation for whatever purpose they use it. And I believe that fundamentally reputational value will be a way to monetize and therefore incentivize the development of these systems. I'm a believer that this will solve the problem of lots of systems that don't have anybody paying for them, because we will pay for the preservation and development and upgrading of the system through reputation tokens.
I think one of the problems that we have in general with identities is like we are in a chicken and egg problem. We have use case, but we don't have a playground. Like no one is really using on the real world. So everyone have a lot of ideas. Everyone have a lot of like its own vision on how it should be, but we have no way to prove it, right? And because it requires such a strong network effect, it will take some time to really see what's like the system that really like sticks. And with that, I want to relate what you were saying about reputation systems. At the end, an identity is just to sustain a reputation system. It's not, I mean, the two concepts are almost the same. It's just like how you frame it. And my perspective is that probably the way that the identity systems is gonna, one identity system is gonna pop up and be used is because it will be required by a reputation system and not the other way around. So probably there will be like a CryptoKitties, like another like super cool dApp that will require specific claims, and that what so it will require reputation to participate, and that will generate like an identity to fulfill this reputation. And what I'm seeing right now is like we're building it on the other way around, right? Like we want to build like the super clean, nice system so we can fulfill reputations, but that's probably not how like the market's gonna play.
I would predict that one of the early reputation use cases is going to be fiat crypto on-off ramps. For example, a stable coin token that you want to move euros or dollars onto a stable coin through a banking system. And that requires some form of reputation or attestation as to the legitimate use of the fiat banking system. Banks will want to see that that person using the system meets the legacy banking requirements. And I think that would fund the entire development of sovereign identity systems, because there's such a very big, large amount of money and a large demand for that on-off ramp between fiat and crypto.
Do you think actually there is like a problem like to fund these projects? Because my understanding is like most of these projects are pretty well funded already. And the other thing I want to add is that probably a better example for I first said maybe there will be like killer app that will ask for like a reputation system, but probably that will be more like a government or like elections or like some like big authority that some like it decides to use like a reputation like an identity for any reason, right? And suddenly like you'll have like millions of people suddenly using this X identity system.
Yeah, so right now we're talking kind of the path of how to get to this like sovereign identity, and also a concrete vision of what it would look like. But kind of straying aside from the reputation thing, I think there's also another path to this like sovereign identity as well. Personally, I worked for a few months at a company on the project around kind of the personal data platform. And it was always the question, like, how do we give like control to the individuals around their personal data? What can we do with that? So one of the things that came out was like, oh, one of the ways to make it really nice to have control over your data is if you have all your data, you can start having a really good user experience between different applications, because your data comes with you and you share it however you want. But very quickly, this went into the idea that, wait, but we're like trying to gather all the personal data into one secure like system controlled by the individual. That's basically like unifying the digital identity, and that may be like another path as well, another kind of vision for what a really interesting system introducing digital identity could look like as a way, to regain control of your data. And that could definitely also be tied to reputations, like just it's also reputations claims about you. It's also data, But I think it's important to realize that maybe like we have like a pure foundation today, or we're trying to build a pure foundation in terms of like system, and it's also starting out from a really like ideological perspective around, we want like a sovereign identity that's separate from any authority, any government, but we have to make it clear to the outside world what it enables, what's like painting the vision that we have for this like new system and what it enables uniquely.
Just want to mention that something that's important when we talk about reputation systems, I would like to note that ideally, the problem of reputation is what algorithm or what are the measure, okay? And I think that's important that we start thinking that reputation, that we are also free to choose which algorithm or how we measure this reputation. The reputation that's measure a bank for the individuals is has his scale, has his rules, has his way to do. Yeah, and we have, but we can have a different measure, and we should be able to choose who we want to trust. Maybe there is people that want to trust governments. Maybe there is people that want to trust private companies. Maybe there is people that trust more in some associations. Maybe there is people that trust ratings. So I think here is important the freedom of the persons to choose how they want to read this data. So, and here is so if we want to create a real decentralized identity system, of course we need this trusted layer, so that we need everybody should be able to do as many claims as they want. And when say everybody, I mean any identity. I don't care if it's a central government or if it is a fake identity that I just created yesterday in whatever. They have exactly the same right to create as many claims as they want. They are exactly, from the blockchain perspective, they are just entities. They are just identities. And the claims, and going back what you were saying, because I think it's interesting, this kind of data, about the data protection. The claim, so the owner of a claim is who's making the claim. Okay, not who's receiving the claim. I can make a claim over him, and he cannot even be aware. Okay, so the owner of the claim is who's making the claim. Other thing is that I just give this data to him, so he can use this claim to prove maybe to third party that I said that. Okay, but the owner, the initial owner of the claim is who's making the claim. And we need to distinguish that with the legality or the legitimacy, that what can you do with the data that you have. Of course, you hold a lot of information, and you cannot do whatever you want with all the information you have. And of course, all these GDPR and all these rules at the end are systems that the humans just think about protecting what the people can say about me. But the ownership of the data is the owner, is who's, in the case of the claims, is who's making the claim. It's not who's receiving the claim. And that's, I think that's our concepts that are, that they are a little different when we talk in a normal centralized identity systems. But this is this equality between identities from the technical perspective is what really can change the world, and this freedom of choosing who we want to trust on.
Yeah, just to give some precision, I'll give the mic right after. The path through which we actually arrived to a digital sovereign identity, it wasn't really about claims. Hence, I didn't give this precision. It was more about the data you generate and you can own, or you should own when you use services online. It was a very service-focused approach at first, and then it kind of oh, but we're gathering all this data at the same place and giving back ownership. That's basically a digital identity. So we should look into that as well. But it wasn't focused on the claims, which are often the very core of the digital identity systems we think about today. It was to showcase kind of a different path through which we arrived at this point.
I'm connecting to a service, okay? So of course I know this information that I've been connected to a service, okay? But the service also know that I've been connected. So the information is shared. I connected to a service. That means that the service has an information that I connected, and I have an information that the service connected. Okay. So in general, who's this data belongs? No, the information is who has the, so the original information is who has the information. In this case, both. But what's interesting here is the other one's data. So the proof that can generate the data that, for example, that they have the service provider can give me a proof, or can make some claim that then I can test with somebody else on that. But the original data is from the service. of course, he can give me this data to me, or I can have the right to ask for this data to him. I can have even the right to ask him not to share this data or not to use this data in a different way. But if we talk about the original, so the ownership, at the end is who's making the claim is the service, or or the other way around. Who's making the claim is me. I can make a claim that I connected to a service, and then the service can share. But the original of the data is who has the data and the original owner. Okay.
Very quick question, but I find the approach super interesting. If I'm, for example, like using a Fitbit, like the watch, I'm like going for a run, have like all things measured, my performance measured. So the way we conceived it was, okay, this information you just created, like about your run, your health, your sports performances, like belongs to you, and it should go to your personal data store. Do you see it as like also claim is made by Fitbit about your performance on this run? Is that like how I understand?
The data is yours, okay? So is your so that you get this data. If you have, the other thing is that if you are interested, for example, in some third party at the states that you maybe make something, but in any case, and this is I think it's important, privacy should be should be designed as a default. So what I cannot think, and what I think that's a huge sin, and this cannot happen, is that you buy a nice watch, and all your personal data, without even asking you or asking in a bad way, this data go to you don't know who even is going, where it's going to go. This is for me is unthinkable. Okay. Other thing is no, I have all my data. It's in my watch. I keep it myself, but I want to share this data. Of course, it's your data. You do whatever you want with your data. But by default, and I think this is important in the design, in the world design. So privacy should be by design, by default. So it's, it cannot be cameras on the street by default. By default, the street should be without cameras. Okay, it's like if you want to choose that you film it, then you should be able to do it. But by default, and this is, I think this is from the applications and from the application perspective, this is something that has not been taken into account during the last years. Now you connect to Facebook, and by default you give away everything. You're connecting to the pages, web pages, and all this data is giving away everything. At most, they give you a click that you cannot do anything else unless you click something somewhere without reading. So this, of course, here is also a lot of education between the people. But here, the applications designers, I think that has a responsibility to think in that direction and making the people conscious about the data. And that doesn't mean that the people cannot share the information. Of course, it's your.
I think what Jordi's described is really the front line of the battle for society to regain control of our personal data, and it's going to require a lot of education of the community as a whole, because yes, if we buy a wearable device that automatically shares our personal fitness and health data, that's bad, because we no longer control it, because it's automatically shared. But even if we have the control of how we share it, if somehow that identity of who we are is linked to, let's say, our national identity document, passport, then we've immediately lost control, because it's linked to all of our other activities through that identity document. We need to preserve the sovereign independence of every identity that we choose to share. And that's so vital that and most people in human society don't understand that yet. So we need to promote that.
I really like the point, just going back to, I guess, a few things going back to, having the data, having us own our data, absolutely. And I like the idea of maybe having, say, an equation of sorts that attests to a certain fact. So if you have a Fitbit, it could be your heart rate, and then someone might say, well, if you want to come to our sporting venue, you must have a certain, like, not a heart condition, but they can infer that from your data. So if you choose to share the data, or perhaps the other way around, they share their a circuit of sorts, and then your data, your private data, satisfies their criteria, then you have access to that facility because your heart rate's in good condition. And I like, just tying everything together, I really liked that around keeping the attributes separate, because I think that's what Swarm City sort of aims for, as I understand it. You have sort of hashtags for certain attributes, you build up sort of reputation tokens per attribute, and you can, at your discretion, choose to share some or the other. And I think it will get interesting around, because I try to look at it from both sides. That's a really positive use case. But what about the negative? Maybe you selectively share your heart rate data just to get into a certain sports facility when really you had maybe a bad heart thing, and but you're choosing to not share that data, and instead you're satisfying their criteria with when you were healthy or something like that. So you could perhaps manipulate it a little bit when that control is there. But again, perhaps it can be can be like you need to have shared X months of recent data. And so the criteria can perhaps just get more complex to satisfy a certain thing. But yeah, I'll pick up another point after.
So I think one way probably we can differentiate reputation with identity is just a set of features, claims, attributes, and reputations is what we made out of it, right? It's like an extrapolation of all these sets, and now like we have like a number, quantity that we can make use and make sense for what we want. And what you were saying about like, okay, what happens now? I went to this gym and now I expose these attributes, but I don't want them to make use. I think that's when it's very cool, all the ZK stuff. Like here you can prove something without mentioning what you actually have. What I want to get, like we're talking right now like about the technological problem, like how do we solve all that? But to me, like the biggest problem, it's not technological, but social. Yeah, like how do we make, like you can have all these technologies, like people can have their own data, and now they get into the app and the app asks them for everything, and I just click okay, right? And how do we get through that? How do we make people understand the importance of keeping their data, and how we like put measures to like protect the people? How we make a sandbox?
This is by the design of the apps, and that's the key. Is of course education is key, of course, so you cannot avoid, but the design of the apps. If the apps designers just think privacy in by default in mind, we will get a big state. Let me go as an example. Yeah, for example, in the claim system, I want to prove somebody else a claim system. Okay, I can use a normal claim. So maybe I can just show you all the data. You have all the information, all the proofs, everything. That's one way to do it. I can make you a zero knowledge proof, just showing you the data that you really need at that point. But I can even go further. And here is, for example, something that we in NIREN 3 are working hard on that, and it's the non-reusable of the proofs. I can prove you whatever information I want to make you. I don't know, I can prove you that I'm 18, I can prove you that I have some illness in somewhere, or I can prove you that I belong to any religion on anything. So I can prove you any claim that a third party made, trusted third party made to you. But with zero knowledge, this allows to make you a claim that you can take this proof, and even if you publish this proof or if you share this proof with somebody else, this proof is not going to be usable anymore. Okay? And this is something that the technology allows. And if you do that by default, if you use these techniques of privacy, just sharing the minimum information by default, then well, that's where really you start controlling your real identity on the stuff.
Yeah, and I think the challenge with that is around those who don't do that by default have an advantage because they're selling data. They're making more money. They've got a financial advantage as the current system is against those who are doing the right thing and protecting the data and also not generating revenue off that data. If somehow the division of these attributes produces a superior service and makes a superior application, then great. But I'm perhaps right now I can't see what that is. But that's just the challenge. It's like an uphill battle in a way, or you're against an enemy who makes a lot from the exploitation of that data.
Yeah, I think that's the whole question of how do we get like people that, in general, the vast majority of people don't pay that much attention to their privacy right now, or they they are kind of conscious about what's happening. They say that, but in practice, like the actions don't follow. Maybe because of a lack of education, and we really need that as well. But I think we also need to have a more strategic point of view around like, okay, but what are we enabling, which is really interesting for everyone because of that. And I think something that's kind of overlooked a lot of the time is this like separation of data and ownership of data is actually a vastly better user experience, because the fact that you can that your data basically goes with you anywhere on the internet, and that you can choose what you share, and that enables you, for example, well, I'm going to use existing services as an example, but let's imagine these are like compatible with these identity systems and privacy by design. I'm on Spotify. I'm on listening to music. I really like this music, but there's like this artist I really love. He's not like on Spotify, and I want to find some tracks. So I'm going like on SoundCloud, but because these like the data I have about my listening habits and those suggestions and all this very convenient stuff actually comes with me and belongs to me, and I control it. It's actually exactly the same on SoundCloud. Just the interface changes, but the data stays the same, and that's a user experience that could be so powerful. It's the end of lock-in actually, and this experience can be so powerful that if you give like very simple, concrete examples to people, it actually like resonates immediately. And I think we have to keep that in mind. It's not something very abstract or far away. There's like some very, very strong incentive to actually use that if we can create it.
Yeah, just wondering how we can perhaps discern like that difference with people. Like as a consumer, I know people go to sites, they'll talk about something, and then they'll joke and say, "Oh wow, my phone was listening to me because now I see an ad for what I was talking about." People are seeing it happen, and they're finding it a bit magical, a bit creepy, but they don't mind still, and that's the problem. Like there's this complacency, and yeah, the way people aren't caring so much about that. And I'm not sure how that'll change. I don't know if that user experience of having your your song preferences in one place immediately appearing in another will be seen as a novel thing, because it's kind of happening in terms of ads at least. But yeah.
So to paraphrase Elon Musk in electric cars, is it really a supply problem or a demand problem? If you look at that analogy, the traditional automakers all said there was no demand. That's why they built ugly, expensive, short-range electric cars, because there was no demand. And it took somebody with the chutzpah to say, no, actually, we have a supply problem. You just build crappy-looking cars that, So is the challenge to everybody here at this conference to build actually applications that don't rely on monetizing data, and that's really the only business model that they have, that there is no otherwise real business model.
Yeah, I agree. We have to build applications that allow individuals to contribute their data to whatever social group or application they need without giving up control for money, or because the application wants their data for money. Now, one of the cases where this is going to be very important is personal genomic data. We all have a genome that's unique to us and our identical sibling twins, and as things develop, we're going to be asked to share much of this. Some of it may be taken from us without our consent, but many times we'll be asked to share genomic information for health and treatment purposes. But once it's out there in the public domain, it's very difficult to take it back. So if you give it to the wrong person, you've lost it forever.
This data you should never have to give it away. But by default, this is something that, that's
That I agree, but many governments are taking it anyway. from children who are born. They take their genomic information and file it against their birth records.
Oh, no, sorry. Just on in Australia, it's actually just reminded me that we had an opt-out system. Jeff, you remember that we were given 3 months to opt out of the government taking our health data. It wasn't by default opt-in. It was like, well, we're going to take your data, we're going to share it amongst different agencies, and if you don't want that to happen, contact something. And I've forgotten about it, and it's getting close. So you've just reminded me. It's tomorrow. Okay. Well, I'm going to just get connected and opt out of. Yeah. Sorry. Just thank you.
I just wanted to introduce talking about how we get people to actually care about that and use these systems. Very simple killer app, like a hack to get users. Automatically filling your taxes. There's just that. Like, if there's like a way to interface with that, that's gonna trap so many people in, and that's just a very simple example of why this is actually such a good thing to have, a good user experience. It's just about now we need to make it happen. But on the other side of the thing, this is a really good user experience. But for example, the genomic data, why we still need people to care about like not giving this information away, because it's not going to be like, oh, from one day to the other, suddenly everything is private with an amazing user experience around that. It's going to be, oh, you have these services asking to take your genomic data and like own it, and then you have maybe the developing options that are still kind of unstable around like controlling your data. And how do we providing some use cases help, but education is also like a really big part of that.
So, which is first education, because we are a new generation of people who in general doesn't mind to share all their information. So, how long is going to take to this change of mindset in this new generation?
I know. Regarding to that, I believe that changing the mindset is like a long period of time. I believe that the technology we're building right now will actually lead to that. Like, we'll be forced actually. What you said, default by design. It will like by design will be done. Like, if you know what I mean. So, all the products or all the technology, all the ideas, whatever or algorithms we're building, the systems will actually make the whole system fair enough, and we will get to that point, faster than changing the mindset of people. You know what I mean? I mean, education is important. We tried it before, but people don't give a shit about it. So it should support, but I believe through usage of all this system, it will that will change the mindset to the fairness of the whole system.
I think the problem with this is that there's always, for every application that is going to be private by design, there's going to be an equivalent that is really not private. So the question is, either there's like two options. Either how do you get people to care to choose the option that is private by design, or how does this more like respectful option provide you with something that the other can't? Because otherwise, the other one is going to win, and this is something you need. And even if we're building this like decentralized system, and most people like developing applications in these Web3 applications today actually care about this, at some point you're gonna have lots of Web3 application that really like don't respect your privacy, and we can't rely just on the applications being private by design. We need some way to either education or better experience to get people to use that, to make a choice actually.
Like, I might be a bit edgy with this, but could hacktivism help? Because like just a couple of weeks ago, Facebook was hacked, and there were 50 million accounts compromised. And if that guy that hacked these 50 million accounts was like privacy inclined, he could have done something that would have like a huge, uh, like collective consciousness effect, right? He could have taken private messages of these people and published them on their wall, for example, or he could have done that's a bit, you know, to there. But there are options too, because like these centralized systems that don't respect privacy, they are fragile, right? They could be compromised, and this could be used to promote the private respecting.
Can I make a point about when there are both options that are private and non-private, and how do we get the people to change and educate them? I think that what's important here is to have a critical mass of people who have a very strong stance on it. But as was mentioned before, I think it's a supply problem at this moment, because to have a strong stance, for example, about Facebook, while there are no real decentralized alternatives, you just have to miss out on a part of a life experience. And while it can be a stance that you can adopt, it's a stance that's very hard to proselytize to other people around you, for whom this convenience is more important than the privacy. But when the real options, other more decentralized private options emerge, then you can have a much more solid stance on this and just say, no, I'm not going to use Facebook, I'm going to use this, and you should be the one to change. And while you get the critical mass, the others will adopt.
Just a couple of comments. I think that we are in a very right moment for introducing this kind of applications. I agree that, yeah, right now you go to Facebook. Facebook is free. You don't have to pay nothing, and you have a service. So you are paying that with your data. So I think that if we want services that don't use our data, we'll have to find a way to pay for. So that's something that, you know, it makes sense to me. But right now, I think that with cryptocurrencies, with something, I think that micropayments and applications based in small fees that maybe it costs you, I don't know, €0.50 a month, you know, something that are very small amounts that's possible to pay them easily, transparently, without any inconvenience. That's not, you know, but without the feeling of the user that you are all the time paying. You know, this is something that we need to do. I think that we are a good opportunity in the crypto just to start seeing those applications on that. That's one comment. And the other is privacy by default is not only from the user perspective. You know, for example, for the server. So I want to start seeing services where they just delete all the information they have. So they don't save. You know, they take it at the moment they have and they erase that. And you know, here we have some inconvenience. First of all, for example, it's just the laws of a lot of countries that they just, a lot of companies, they have like the obligation to keep records for the last 6 months and things like that. So that's the first thing that we are seeing right now. And yeah, and the other, I think it's interesting, and it's another interesting approach is to put incentives for the end user for if data is leaked, so that the services have a good incentive to delete your data. As an example, for example, I don't know if any of you has managed databases and so on, and when you have a database, you need to know if data is leaked, and especially if a database has access to many people, many employees, many things of that. And there are techniques to do that. One of those, for example, is just to put fake records, maybe with your address. And so if you receive someday some letter from to this name to that address, you know that. This kind of techniques can be applied very much. For example, to put an incentive, you can have, for example, you know, a pot of money, you know, that's bucket, that if it's proved that data is leaked in some way, then you can get the money back. But putting this kind of incentives, in the services is something that can help just to start having applications where privacy is by default and is taken account seriously. Besides the laws and all the other techniques that, of course, are important too for protecting.
Yeah, I'm just thinking we've gone, I guess, towards privacy and data, which is kind of the, I guess, underpinning identity and say reputation. But to go back to the application and how it could be possibly rewarding for a product or a company to protect their users' data. I'm just thinking something like a song service that is willing to pay for the specific data. Maybe that sort of silos them, that they're only interested in one attribute. And to go back to, if the user has control of each of their attributes and selectively share, that's probably the way it is at the moment. Companies will pay for the data on the attribute that they're providing a service for. But to reward someone owning all of their data, it could be the fusion of different elements to a specific service could be what makes it more valuable. So it's hard to think of an example, but if there is something that uses different facets of your identity and different elements of you to provide a richer service that no focused traditional capitalist kind of product will be doing, like maybe there's something there. I don't know if anyone wants to help flesh that out.
I was actually thinking about if like a platform that allows for direct monetization of user data as opposed to indirect monetization of user data could be the first step. So it's like if you will use our version of this social service or social application, you can actually make money, right? It's not that somebody else is making money behind your back. And this act of selling your data, like consciously, actually makes the user also more conscious of what he is getting rid of, right? So this could be like a...
So a use case of this that I have in mind comes back to genomic and healthcare data. So in order to develop therapies and cures for all sorts of diseases and human conditions requires sharing lots of individuals to share their genomic data and their healthcare data, fitness, blood pressure, daily measurements, with researchers so that they can study the links between genomic conditions and health conditions. So the question is, in my mind, is can we have a system that's private by default so that individuals can share or can put onto a shareable database their genomic condition and their health condition, but only share the minimum necessary to find a cure for specific disease without sharing everything else in their life forever?
I guess if that's that granular control would be quite good. And I like that point of getting people's mindset into the fact that their data is valuable, and that might be a bit of an uphill battle in isolation. It might not be, maybe someone will say, oh, I can sell my heart rate data, I'm going to get some money for it. Like if they're not currently going to the shop and selling their data, it's not in their ritual, it might be a harder thing to catch. But what I was thinking was, say, if it becomes part of a ritual, like maybe it's like a subscription model where if you're offering regular bytes of data, snippets of data that are of value to someone else directly, maybe you can subsidize the subscription. So I'm thinking Netflix, you're watching a movie, you're sharing your heart rate. Like imagine if you had a reduction in your monthly Netflix because you're providing your emotional response, which could be of value in other forms.
So another way to do that might be, when you contribute your genomic data, you get paid for it with a token. When you contribute your daily heart rate or immune system condition, you get paid with some more of that token. So you build up an account against your identity of the token. You can then use that token to buy something, to pay your subscriptions, to convert it into fiat coin. But if the system is private by default, you're happy to sell your data because you know it's only going to be used for specific purposes that you agree to.
But how do you collect this data to your identity? Because applications need to be implemented. Would it be necessary to a little help of governments so you are able to grab this information to your identity? Because if you're competing with existing applications which manage your information with commercial purposes, how does it start?
Yeah, I guess the hard part is having that quality data in the first place and knowing you're measuring it correctly. So yeah, having an attestation to the quality is a tough one. But if you're like if perhaps the lens, the measurement of that attribute, say it's an equation, a zero knowledge proof, if you're just generating the proof and that's all what you're submitting, that can be under the hood. Again, everyday users probably don't need to think about it, but they should be rewarded for it. And maybe that's the way you know only a certain amount of data is going out, because you're just providing the proof of a claim that they've requested. But yeah, sorry, you had a point?
Yeah. Actually, just wanted to float a question, because one of the challenges is that you may have that relationship with somebody, with a organization, trade it, exchange your information, but then there's the question of what do they do with it once they have it? And if that organization is purchased, there's not necessarily a guarantee. Usually in the fine print of the terms and conditions, they say they might change how they're going to treat your, how they behave in the future, and it's very hard. What are people's thoughts? I was talking with a colleague about a legal structure, a different corporate legal structure of a data fiduciary. And it was really more of a brainstorm at this point, but creating, like you have a B Corps now, general benefit corporations or nonprofits, but creating a corporate structure that says that you will honor these certain concepts of how you're handling data, and it then becomes part of the legal governance, because there is a huge amount of pressure in every organization. Otherwise, particularly if you've collected information and maybe your revenue plans aren't hitting where they're supposed to be, but then you look at this giant data pool and say, well, maybe
maybe something part of corporate social responsibility.
I like the idea of having a corporate structure that has a governance that protects privacy of data. The problem is I don't trust corporate structures because they're vulnerable to attack by the governments that supervise, that created that regime. And if governments can, they will subvert the mechanism. So we have to do it on the blockchain. That's the only way. We cannot rely on corporate structures that are created by nation states.
Just for this concrete example now of sharing some illness, genoma. In general, when you are doing studies, the most important operation, the most important statistical operation that you are doing is just a correlation between two variables. Okay, so just imagine a system that you take these two variables, you generate a zero knowledge proof that just extract this. So you know that there is a person, a real person, that has these two persons and only a single person that has these two variables sharing this information. And you are sharing this information to a specific entity with reputation. No, you know who you are sharing to. And you know that this data, so this information, this proof that you are generating about this medical data to this is not shareable. So this person can generate as many proofs of that kind as they want. So this information is not shareable. And in top of all that, you even receive some token just for sharing all that. I want to live in a society like that.
Yes. One thing that is crazy to me is that like limited liability companies in many countries have to be transparent and auditable, like financially transparent and auditable, right? But we have no correlate analog of it in case of informations. So companies are in their agreements with users, right? They are often limiting their liability for data leaks and so on. But I think that should go hand in hand with being informationally technologically transparent. So these companies should be open source, for example. I think at least. Like if you don't want to guarantee covering damages from information leaks, for example, and so on, your infrastructure should be transparent. I think that should be legally mandated, or it makes sense to me.
I have nothing more to say.
Yeah, come on in. Thank you. Take a seat.
Because they should be transparent, but sometimes you cannot be transparent, but you need user data, and you need the honest user data. For example, medical researchers. So I can share my data, and we can incentivize this with tokens if people understand what is the use of tokens, that I will anonymously or not anonymously share my data for the medical research to like Parkinson disease, to have this like big data, really huge volumes of big data. And as a medical research center, I don't want to have a transparency of my data, but I will need to notify users with what universities or with what research centers I will share my data later. So when I'm sharing data with this particular entity, because I trust them and I know the purpose of use, and I know that like it's not about the transparency, it's about the trust. Like I trust them, my data will not leak behind the like collaboration or alliance of these universities, and it may circulate around the whole world, but it will never leave particular collaboration of universities, just because I'm sharing this for medical purposes.
By transparency, I didn't mean transparency of the data itself, but the transparency of the infrastructure and of the processes that surround the how the data is handled, what software handles the data in what way, and so on. So the data itself like can remain opaque, right? But everything else.
But for users, it's not important. I just need to completely prove that if I will share something, it will not go publicly on somebody.
Like if the software is closed source, you can't ensure it because.
The problem of the data is that once leaked, it's gone. Okay, so you can do whatever you want. You can trust an university. You can trust whatever you want. But once leaked, it's gone. And that's why I think that's important that you never share the raw data. You should always share zero knowledge. You should always share that minimal piece of information that doesn't link to your identity in any case, to use whatever you want. And this should be by default. So I do not accept that somebody trusted, legit, your mom is asking for all your data because she's gonna use that data in the right way. I cannot accept a society that uses this mechanism of just sharing, with your mom. I don't care. So I just want to put the most trusted person in front of you. Once your data is leaked, it's gone.
I absolutely agree with what Jordi said, that because you may trust your mum, but she can get hacked and then everything's gone. So you must not trust anybody with your data. Don't trust your mum with the data. Not because you don't trust your mum, it's because she can get hacked and then it's gone.
You got a point to add? Yep.
Just following the minimum amount of data, I think it depends on cases. It seriously depends on the case, because again, you mentioned the defaults, and defaults depends on cases, and defaults depends on users. So what is the default for this particular case, for this particular service, for this particular reason? And for somebody, you need to preset the default because they completely don't understand what is following then, and then you need to have this minimum amount of data so you can make them secure from all these data leaks, and you will not freak them out as users, so will not leave later. But for some cases, for some users, you can open up a little bit of certain defaults, and then can identify what is the default. And if getting back for research centers, if they need not the minimum amount of data, because minimum amount of data will not make a use for them, they need a little bit more, so they have this default preset for the non-technical users. But then they have a little bit upper if you are a little bit advanced, so you can read the terms that are seriously should be very short, and then you can share that amount of data that they can use and make of. And like in these defaults are safe for all others around, but they have also like the benefit for the centers that like acquire, like asking for this data.
And I guess, yeah, the ideal being that, like, if we're able to just share insights on the data rather than the raw data itself, that would be, I guess, a bit better, like the zero knowledge proofs.
Let me, and I know a bit about the zero knowledge proofs, but my understanding is that you have to have the question in order for a zero knowledge proof to be actually usable. So if you're in, and this is a little bit, I think, to your point, if you're in basic research where you're trying to understand and you don't know what the question is, then zero knowledge proofs isn't going to work, is it?
Zero knowledge proof are in the very early stage in research. Okay, so talking about something that's very early stage is difficult to think, but at least the way that I'm seeing. Okay, that's what I think. So data should be, one thing is data availability. So I'm going to where is this? Just okay. So going to what you said. Of course, maybe these scientists will have many needs of the data during the time, because the research will need at some point. I think it's better just to access the data when you need it. So when you need that data, then the availability of the data the system should be in a way that there is no delay in asking the data. So if you can share the data when really is needed. And here is where the point is, and the zero knowledge proof, of course, a lot, it's a research, work in progress. It's a research, but in research, you should be able to define some standard circuits, if you want, or some standard programs that, if you want, are parametric programs, so that you can, in some way or the other, share. So maybe you have different problems, but maybe you have the same patterns. So having same patterns, you can use the same circuits and use the same techniques to share some specifics data on that. But again, work in progress. The world has no experience on that, so we'll see.
Just a quick, then I'll. But then we have. I think it's a bit of a circular challenge. If you have multiple questions, so you go back and you ask this zero knowledge question, this zero knowledge question, this zero knowledge question, this zero knowledge question, you can re-identify the person. You can now determine identity, because the more you have those questions, you actually create a unique profile of the individual.
Not really. If you do it anonymously and independently. I mean, so this information that's revealing should not be linked. So one query should not be linked to the next query. So you have one query that maybe relates to variables, and the next query, it relates to variables, but you cannot relate three variables. So you have two variables here and two variables there. You should have like a cross variable to link one another. Okay. So, and here is where you can start putting some some information on some tricks on that, just to protect that. Agree, that's one of the challenges that we need to work on. Okay, but that's I would love to be in that level. so that's if we start having this so this discussion, I think that's a discussion that we will have maybe in 10 years or in 20 years when we have these systems. Agree. But right now the system is that what I cannot accept under any circumstance is that you just give your data by default.
Yeah, and I think to that point, also we are very used to the fact that now, yeah, but we have to link this data, because if you want to log in somewhere, it's like, yeah, but you can use your Facebook account and this and that. So it's a system we have been made used to, but it's not needed, because you can just say, now if you just think of private and public keys, you can just say, but I can prove my identity. That's all we need. The rest you can forget, right? So that's already a way to keep the different identities separate, I think, because if it's needed, you can prove it. But apart from that, I had a question actually, which is something that I'm wondering about the bigger picture when it comes to, we know here, identity is important, that you own your data, that you can do this. But I think 99% of the people do not. And so, like, there's coders, they have a special kind of brain, so they go deep in the problem and they know this and they research this. And I think when I think of Catalonia, you know, like, how important it is that you have control over your own life, over your own situation. And then I'm wondering, like, do we always need trouble and real violence or something that is really scandalous to provoke people to actually think about the fact, such as a Facebook hack, etc., and then even not so many people reacted? But how are we gonna get this mind shift? Because when I now talk to people, they're like, they have no clue why it's so important. So how are we gonna get there? I don't know who wants to answer.
Maybe I can share some insights. The next workshop, Design for Non-Technical Users. Yeah, seriously, because Yellowcom, we are also self-sovereign identity, and it was founded by developers. And now we're facing the problem how to explain the value of self-sovereign identity and the identity itself to completely non-technical users that are following after the services. And there are tools, but like again, following the question, do we need drama like this hacks? Actually, yes. We don't need them we don't need facilitate, and I hope we will not. But it's always helpful to write the drama of those big players like Facebook to like promote the better rep, because it's how non-technical users think. Like drama attracts. It's proved by years of advertising.
So yeah, I guess there's the negative emotion to say, oh, don't let this bad thing happen, or this is, you could be censored. Here's a way to not have, or here's a way to have censorship resistance. But again, thinking of the product side, is there a positive that can somehow just outweigh it? That would be nice to know. But yeah, I'm not sure. Sorry.
I fully agree. Sorry, but I fully agree on that. And yeah, experience. So it's like the people that appreciate more freedom is the people that have been in prison. So it's just as that is that if the people that appreciate more privacy is the people that somebody use of privacy. The people that appreciate more decentralization is the people that has been attacked by a central party. And this is happens, and that's very important that we get conscious. And I will link there is two ways to get that. One is for own experience, and the other is for education. I think from education, good education from the beginning, you can it's just a rational thing. You can understand, and you can be aware. You can have awareness, but just doing a rationalization of why all these elements of privacy, decentralization, freedom are important. And that's the way to go.
I just want to repeat maybe what you said in terms of scandal is like putting fear inside people. It's a way to create a behavior on people by going through this route of fear. But what reminds me all this talk is, for example, if we need to change people's minds in all these terms. I agree that the importance of having your data and this idea of private by design is key. But first, you need to make this idea understandable for people who are designing these systems, and to know to really learn the why is behind this idea. You really need to do the click, and I just want to put the example that is different in the education system, that you teach children and you impose some knowledge than other techniques that make children learn by themselves because of the experience, because of the failure. It's different that, okay, somebody stole my keys or somebody attacked my account, and suddenly I lose everything, and suddenly this becomes something personal. This is something that you understand in your own flesh, and then you can start building your. It's like, obviously, education is important because it's a way to give you all this information without being to failure by yourself. It's something like giving some advice first, and maybe you can consider without. Yeah, it's just talking about the same, but it's interesting how, or well, my question is, how can we explain that or put the whole society in a situation that they have to really think about that, not just, okay, I'm logging into this new platform because it's cool, and the designers that did this platform know at the beginning that private is by default, but these designers are humans too, and maybe they need to do this step first, and I put them all in the same society. So I think that the approach is global. It's not just okay, we have to know that, and we are the only ones that we're gonna do this change. It's not for me.
Some questions never get to be answered, unfortunately. This was an amazing discussion. Can I get a round of applause for everyone that participated? That was amazing. We really built something, a really great conversation there. And now we're going to do the same for a different topic. If you want to keep talking identity, there's a UX discussion, a designing for non-technical users, and they're going to talk about identity a lot right behind us. So we might turn down the volume a little bit for this next discussion, which is about open source culture and actually supporting open source development. It's a very interesting topic, and another one that we don't really have answers for yet. We have some experts though, and we're going to follow the same format. So remember, you guys are all part of the discussion. You're more than welcome to sit down in these chairs and participate. In fact, it works much better that way. So.
Sorry to interrupt. Just before we get off the identity topic, we have a breakout room at DevCon happening on November 2nd from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. So everyone's welcome to come carry on that conversation. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, man. So yeah, I'll let Scott and I'll let the Gitcoin crew take it away.
Awesome, thanks, Griff. So yeah, really the starting point here, I think, is just to kind of get you guys to think about what open source is, what it means to you guys, and sort of to start, how many of you work on projects that are fundamentally open source, that are currently. So a lot of you, right? That's great. That's a lot more than in the traditional software world. So that's already a good start, right? We're already in a space where most people are kind of familiar with this concept and are actually actively engaging in it. So that's great. I'd actually like to start off, I guess, just by talking a bit about sort of the history of open source. There's actually a great presentation by Andy Tudhope that I want to reference as well, which goes all the way back to the Universal Dictionary. And these ideas of, what would it be like if we had this complete sort of open source of knowledge that's completely accessible by anyone, usable for any purpose. And so it's an old concept, this idea of having open knowledge and having open collaboration. It's only recently, I think, that we've actually started to really engage with it at a deep level. So the more recent history of open source is Richard Stallman, Linus Torvalds, the early sort of computing days, discussions around licensing. So this idea of, okay, so should you have a license that's like GPL? Should it be about ensuring that the commons is protected from people that are just abusing or not giving back to it? Or should it be about ensuring that it's open to anyone, regardless of whether the intent for the use of the software is commercial or not? But to start, just because I'm going to ramble about licenses for a while, I want to get your perspectives first on and maybe we can just go around for this. What is open source to you? What makes something open source? So does anyone want to give their sort of definition first?
Open source, well, for me is I would say that's everything, especially when you are in crypto. It's like I cannot understand any other development if you are in crypto that's not open source. So that's just by default. Um, I think that the big problem in open source is mainly the funding part. Now, I've been for all my life just dreaming that at some point I would be able to make open source project, and I've been just developing closed source for 20 years with a dream in my mind that at some point I will be able to do it open source. Right now, I'm developing open source. I'm personally, I can say that I'm much free, much better. I feel much better in all the circumstances. And what's more interesting is I think that economically it's possible, and you can even make much more money doing open source projects than just working in a closed source project. And the answer is for me at least, is very clear. When you are doing open source project, you are doing projects that you believe on, that you that you want to build, that you really that you have this that you know that you are going to change something, that you are going to solve real problems, and this is much more worthy than just doing a closed source for a company that you don't even know where the place is.
Yeah, developing open source is about the ideas and about the problem. When you develop closed source software, it's because you're trying to make a bunch of money, and you want to, create artificial scarcity where it doesn't necessarily need to exist. Open source is about abundance and solving problems for the world and creating what I would say is like a common good, a social good, whereas closed source is more selfish and I can't say enough, artificial scarcity.
I was just gonna. I really like that term, artificial scarcity. I hadn't heard that before. I think that's really interesting. The other dimension that I would add is, I think it's a better development style. I think you end up with better contributors in the whole. You end up with projects that have gone in different directions and have kind of stood the test of an open environment. I think that there are new challenges, and we can get into those as well, about maintaining open source code bases. And LA, who is coming right on time, can probably add some perspectives about the maintainer experience. But in general, I would add that as well, that open source is a great part of the ecosystem. So, does anyone else who's working on open source want to give their perspective?
Oh, it's quite pleasurable working with open source software. Yeah. Forgot what I was going to say now. It's quite pleasurable working with open source software because, someone has gone through the efforts of building something already. And so your next move is just to combine them together. And you don't get this opportunity with closed source systems. You work in an organization and someone's built something, you want to reuse it, no, it's too hard. Locked up in some system.
So I like the fact that we're talking about sort of what is open source, and what some of the answers we're getting are largely about your own personal experiences and connection with open source. And I think that speaks to the fact that it is very much a collaborative experience. It's something, when you ask someone what is open source, the first thing that they want to talk about is here's why open source is important to me and why I found it to be valuable in my work. I really like Baki's point in particular, the idea of combining these different existing constituent components into something that's that's not something that's possible with commercial or closed software. And historically, it's been a huge problem with how fast we're able to actually develop new systems. I think it's one of the reasons that this whole ecosystem, the decentralized web, blockchain, whatever you want to call Web3, has grown so quickly, is just because you have access to all of these different components by default. Historically wasn't really an option. Ellie, I haven't given you a chance to give your definition, so do you have a particular sort of thought on what is open source to you?
Many
things. I think the first thing that comes to my head is just this fascinating human collaboration experiment that is proven to be a success. I think that probably if you had explained this 30 years or 40 years to someone, people would be like, nah, that's bullshit. It'll never happen. Why people would do that? And people do that. So for me, open source is primarily inspiration. That, you know, there are more things out there, you know, on the collective side. So yeah, inspiration is the key word.
Yeah, just on Ellie's point, at this point, I think the conversation is more about the history of open source, how we've gotten to today. There's a really interesting paper written in around 1990 by Eric Raymond. It's a paper called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And this kind of talked to the different development approaches of closed source software versus open source software. The Cathedral is the closed source, very structured, hierarchical way to create an open source system, or excuse me, a system. It might work exactly as intentioned, but perhaps for a very specific set of purposes. As opposed to the Bazaar, which is kind of this free-flowing, interesting place that anyone can contribute to, anyone can put their thoughts or ideas towards. And obviously there's fundamental differences and perhaps benefits to cathedrals versus bazaars, but Eric Raven does a really good job of saying, you know, he tells a story of how he watched Linux grow and is just like appalled and and just like kind of doesn't believe that this is possible. And then he does it himself. He builds his own open source project, and he builds it the open source way. He comes up with a set of principles guiding open source, and it's done a lot to drive forward the ecosystem.
Yeah, just I think it's how is this actually working? It's around it's kind of like about accessibility. It's sort of by having a cathedral, your entry barrier is like you have to go up the ranks before you can talk about anything. But with a market or something where there's just much lower entry barrier, people can just get their hands dirty on different things and try it out. And also just observe it, being able to observe something, observe the mechanisms. There's no man behind the curtain. It's just everyone's there working, and you can watch and learn. So it's just this awesome. I sort of want to say garden. I sort of like to answer what is open source. It's almost like a community garden where anyone can get their hands dirty, anyone can help improve a little bit of it, but you can also watch other people improving the garden, and it's just a nice, beautiful thing.
I love this comparison of that, but it's interesting because I think that most of the cathedrals in software has not been done for more than 5-6 persons, and yeah, so that the investment that you need to do a cathedral is just a laptop. So I think these are the keys of the open source, and you know, being able as an individual, as a developer, being able just to think that you can do something better, that you can contribute in something, that you can create something. You know, this is important, incredible. The other thing, and maybe just if you want to go to that say, is like because building the cathedral is quite easy. The problem is then maintaining the cathedral and giving continuation to the cathedral and all that stuff. And I think here is where we should start talking a little bit more about, because I think this is one of the challenges that we have in the open source community for maintaining and for continue developing, and just to okay, we have a cathedral, but we want this cathedral to be nice, and we want this cathedral to be clean, and we want this cathedral that the people go in, continue going in, and yeah, and that's how we do that from an open source perspective, maintaining the soul, the sense of the open source.
Building on that, actually, there's a fascinating talk from Nadia Egfald that used to lead open source at GitHub. I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago, she gave that talk at Strange Loop that had the title Rebuilding the Cathedral. And basically, she was going back to Eric Raymond's book, and she was saying that, yes, Eric's story is good, but, you know, it turned out to be that the cathedral actually is quite broken in many ways, simply because we have just a few individuals doing all of the hard work, and then you have, you know, and these are the maintainers, which I think where you were going, and then we have all of these thousands of contributions, and in the end is, you know, not so collaborative. In the end, it's usually like, we think that open source software is developed always in the open with hundreds of people all the time being very supportive. In the end, it's usually one, two individuals late at night suffering while everyone else is like, where is my feature? What's going on? Why that's not available? So I think for the people that really thinking about sustainability of open source, I think please think about the maintainers. These are usually the heroes behind the scenes that no one talks about. So yeah, okay, I'm gonna pass it on.
I was just gonna add to that quickly. Yeah, I completely agree with that idea. Maintainers are really fundamentally the lifeblood, and so we talk about this idea of maintainer redundancy, which is kind of funny to talk about in a blockchain context. But basically the point is that you need people that actually understand the code base, that have a really formal sort of not just the time to contribute, but also the energy and ability to contribute in a meaningful way. And you can get lots of contributors that do that, but if they only do it on a one-off basis, it doesn't provide you with a long-term way to maintain or sustain that project. And so you need a way to actually ensure that some of those contributors eventually become maintainers, so that you have this redundancy of people that are really core to the project.
So on the note of maintainers, you asked what is open source, and a lot of people have given some really interesting comments that are kind of arty and beautiful and its inspiration, and it is. And the view that we have through the cathedral windows is wonderful at times. But open source is literally just taking code and putting it with a permissive license. And that's what open source is. And so beyond that, open source is a medium through which current power structures are actually reflected. So open source, a lot of it is actually exploitation. A lot of it is people being asked to do stuff after work. A lot of it is people releasing their code and then getting no remuneration for it, no money back, no prestige. A lot of open source is burnout. Which really, really sucks, because we're all huddled by the fire trying to make cool stuff, and some people make it and some people don't. And I say this as someone who loves open source, but for me, open source is how do we fight entropy, and how do we make it a whole lot easier for maintainers to actually stay in the game and be interested and also love what they do as a result of human plasticity and genius, which is really difficult. So.
Yeah, we sometimes confuse open source with free, yeah. So it's oh, and it's why I have to pay something that's free, right? And I think this well, just this is an important concept. Just to for the maintainers, because I think that's important. I've been 20 years of my life working in a closed source company, and in those companies there is I always distinguish two kind of people. Okay, one are the, let's say, the Formula ones, the ones that build cathedrals, if you want, just building. But then there is another piece on those companies. I call it the DSL people. It's people that the maintainers. Okay, but these people that maybe they are not. I would say they are not genius, or they are not considered genius, and maybe they are not. They don't want to be much more problems, but they have, they have a discipline, they have a job, they have a continuity, they put the things together. Their life is very, very structured in general, and those persons are absolutely key in maintaining that. So for me the question is, and they are doing an incredible job, and they are in those companies, they are, those companies give to those people what they really need. Is this peaceful? A lot of time is you have maybe a salary guaranteed for many times, a schedule, or just a set of people, a set of things that this kind of personality, these persons appreciate a lot. So for me the question, and I have not the answer, but the question is, those persons that are playing a very important role in those inside the companies, how those persons can be incorporated, can come to the open source projects and receive what they're receiving in those companies, or even more. And that's, so I don't have the answer, but I think that it's very important that those persons in some way come to there. And we go again maybe to the initial question, is how we finance the open source projects. And I think, Scott, this is your turn.
Yeah, I don't want to jump too quickly into the sustainability aspect, which is a huge part of this, which we will definitely get into. But the ideas of like I really liked your point on free software, actually, like the difference between free software and open source software. There's this distinction that like has been a huge point of contention in the open source community for a long time. Did you want to maybe give like a bit more context on that? Like it sounds like you're relatively familiar with it. Like it's a really good sort of, I think, historical piece to include here.
Does everyone know what floss is? Okay, so yeah, no.
Yeah, it's so fundamentally this comes back in part to like GPL licensing versus like say MIT licensing. This idea of whether or not an actual commercial entity should be able to get any value out of open source software without contributing back to the ecosystem. Richard Stallman was a big proponent of this idea of. Or does anyone else want to give this explanation? Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, so free and libre open source software. So free as, not as in beer, but free as in the other thing. Sam, what was it? Free speech. Okay, so yeah. Oh. No, I keep brain freezing. I'm sorry. I just wrote a thesis on this, and that was a big mistake.
That's good timing, though. When it does come back to you, it'd be good to have more context on that thesis for sure, actually. But yeah, so it's about freedom versus about being, monetarily free, or about being sort of open in the first place. And like, it's more of like, it's this almost distinction between a pragmatic approach and a ideological approach, both of which are valid in a lot of different ways, but which are very distinct in terms of how you actually execute that. And that's where the licensing part comes in. So you have like GPL licensing, which is much more focused on this idea of, look, this is about this ideology of free, like open community, and like if you're not part of that, then you shouldn't be part of this project. And then alternatively, it's about, well, we just want as many people using this as possible. We want to get it out there, and we want it to be open and like collaborative, regardless of the actual reasons or motivations behind that collaboration. But
so part of it has to do with reuse. So how can you reuse the software? Do you have to reuse it in an open setting? And does everything else that you use and modify on top of it have to be free? Or can you use it in your commercial applications and then sell it? So that's kind of the main distinction between the licensing. There's a lot of different other aspects of licensing that are really important, like waivers of liability or citation, or whether you should say that every single person who ever helps is part of the contributor. Most people get this wrong, which is really, really funny. Like pretty much all of GitHub is filled with projects that have used GPL projects as their subsidiaries and then just not reference them correctly. And then there's also another aspect besides how you do, whether it's free or not, or whether people are going to be charging for it later. And that aspect is, do I directly pay for the open source software itself? So there's actually new kinds of licenses now. I don't know if any of you know Kyle Mitchell. He has this really cool thing where you can buy a license if you're a company, but if you use it for open source, then you can have it for free, which is really cool. Yeah. So that's kind of fun, and people are working on that. But basically, it's a continuing conversation that's been going back for around 40 years, which is why it's hard to figure out, like, what does it actually mean? And that's all part of open source, but the majority of people today who enter the market and are starting to write code just think of open source as, it's on GitHub, it has an MIT license, and I can use it. And so when you get into topics of like what is free and what is Libra, that's when you kind of should go read a lot of books and then come back.
Well, yeah, it is. It's the what is freedom kind of thing. But I just on that thought, a lot of the Libre free stuff seems to come from, actually even the closed stuff, a lot of open source philosophy seems to come from commons philosophy and the idea of gifting. Many of these events, there's even gifting ceremonies where it's paid for by the company and people just go, oh, thank you for showing me around and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, I enjoy that side of things. That's all I wanted to say on the subject. But it's good when we're thinking about open source to think about commons as well, because commons has been around a lot longer than open source, so we can learn a lot from that even before computers were applied to it. But then again, that's a lot more than 40 years worth of research, isn't it? Like Yeah, so like I wouldn't be particularly knowledgeable on anything, but back in the day we would gift each other items before we had financial instruments and gold and silvers and all that. We'd pass around shells in like odd islands. I don't even know what they're called, but we gift each other as a way of signifying social status. So those that accumulated wealth was actually just other people going, thank you. You know, so that's what Giveth's about, isn't it? So probably the appropriate place. Then I guess from that kind of side of things, we had a lot of commons areas, which would be like you've probably all heard the green field and the cows grazing, and you overgraze it and you have the rent dissipation of the green field and nobody can then keep their cows on it. That's one very narrow frame to look at it through. There's many more. There's fisheries that people have solved and not solved these problems many times over in the past, and why they work or don't work is down to a lot of conditions. Or usually in a commons you have appropriators and provisioners. From a game theoretic kind of thing, it's two layers, and from the provisioning side it's those that take from the commons and you appropriate the fish to, you know, sell for whatever, and then you have maintainers of the code, the provisioners, and they would provide the commons with a sustainable way of going about what they're doing. So the appropriators can still take the fish because the provisioners are making sure that they don't overfish the fish. But it's an iterative loop.
So one framework that was very helpful on my understanding of the commons was this work that Elinor Ostrom did. Yeah, cool. So she wrote this book 1990 called Governing the Commons, and basically what she did is she said that the world understands public and private goods, but actually not everything is classified as public or private. We also have these things that we call commons, and she used this very simple framework that talked about excludability and subtractability, and this two-dimensional framework basically, where she said that we have things that are impossible to exclude people from, and when people consume them, they don't subtract from the rest, and these are public goods. Think, for example, the air we're breathing. You cannot exclude people from that, and you also, when you consume more air from me, it's okay. You know, there's no biggie. Now, but we also have things where basically it's impossible to exclude people from, but when they overconsume, you subtract from the rest. And this is the case. So, for example, this is the case with I don't know, let's say. Exactly, like that's exactly right. So these are what she coined as common pool resources, which many times we referring as the commons, and then the rest are private goods and public goods. So that's just one conceptual framework that she used, and then she went further from that and said, okay, what's the most optimal way for us to govern the commons? And she looked at markets, she looked at governments, and she looked at communities, and she found out that actually there's not one size fits all. In many cases, for example, like managing fisheries, many times the communities were actually the best to manage that because they had local knowledge and a bunch of other things that were happening down there. But she basically challenged this idea, Hardin's work on the tragedy of the commons, and said that it doesn't have to be that. There are actually many times better ways to manage commons rather than the government or the market, potentially sometimes the community, but not one size fits all solution. So that's one. Yes.
But I guess I'm asking you a question. Amongst those three categories, governments, communities, markets, were there any guidelines? Were there any, so you mentioned social context and specific knowledge for why communities might make sense, in what cases government or markets?
So she came up with actually 7 rules, I think, if I remember correctly, and there's a book of that that's called Rules for Radicals, and I don't remember all of them, don't put me on the spot, but I remember that, for example, she was saying that, for example, self-policing and self-monitoring is very important, and one of the actually interesting use case of the blockchain is that now, for the first time ever, we can use economic incentives to engineer a situation where we self-monitor who's using, right? And that was part of my talk, like downstairs before, which is, oh, in open source we have the dependency graph. The problem is that you can game that, but what if you couldn't? You know, what if we could use economic incentives to keep that dependency graph somehow clean? So that's one rule that's had this idea of communities need to be able to self-monitor. She also had the second rule, which was communities should have a way to enumerate, I think, which you mentioned about enumeration. And then, Alex, do you remember any others of your stuff? See, one other thing that I kept from her research was the idea of local knowledge, and she was saying that basically she was studying communities that were managing commons, for example, like forests. And she said that she had this one use case from Nepal, where basically when foreigners went down to Nepal and they looked at the engineering that they were using to maintain their forests, nothing. And then she was like, they saw the engineering that they were using, and they were like, oh, this is irrelevant. Like, we can do this much better. And then basically they brought like the state-of-the-art technology to try to manage the Nepalese forests, and they failed big time simply because they were lacking local knowledge. So that was another very interesting consideration that she had, is that always respect local knowledge. Oh, you have it? Okay.
Yeah. Feel free. Come, yeah, you should. Yeah. Please. All right. This is awesome. Not expected. This is good. I'm glad we're getting into this. She won a Nobel Prize for this, no?
Yeah. 2009 it says. Cool. Clearly defined boundaries. Well, I should say that's one. There's 7 with an 8th rule here. So 1 is clearly defined boundaries. Individuals or households who have rights to withdraw resource units from the CPR must be clearly defined, as must be boundaries of the CPR itself. 2. 2. Congruence between appropriation and provision rules and local conditions. Congruence between appropriation and provision rules and local conditions. Appropriation rules restricting time, place, technology and or quantity of resource units are related to local conditions and to provision rules requiring labour, material and or money, i.e. that they're linked together in a loop. Collective choice arrangements. Most individuals affected by the operational rules can participate in modifying the operational rules. Monitors who actively audit CPR conditions and appropriator behaviour are accountable to the appropriators or are the appropriators. Ground up. Graduated sanctions. Appropriators who violate operational rules are likely to be assessed graduated sanctions. Depending on the seriousness of the context of the offence, by other appropriators, by officials accountable to these appropriators, or both. So you break the rules, you get scolded. I am. Oh.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I was saying that this particular point on graduated sanctions, I think it's very relevant for blockchains as well, where, you know, as in many forms of governance, we start introducing punishments, but we actually I don't know if we have seen any implementation of graduated sanctions as Ostrom is using them.
Yes, all the proof of stake mainly they are about sanctions. So that's yeah, it's graduated. Yeah, it's but you know, it's work in progress again. But yeah, that's that idea, and it's very powerful on that.
But don't forget that blockchains, while one part of the community, aren't the only part of this community. So all the GitHub stuff, if you have a code of conduct, that's graduated sanctions at a time. If you decide that, hey, if you do this one more time, then you're going to get kicked out. So that's also just as important to blockchain maintenance, is figuring out how you're going to deal with actual users coding as well.
Cool. I'll just give you the last 2 and get out of here. Conflict resolution mechanisms. Appropriators and their officials have rapid access to low-cost arenas to resolve conflicts amongst appropriators or between appropriators and officials, i.e. court system. Minimal recognition of rights to organize, the rights to appropriators to devise their own institutions are not challenged by external governmental authorities, i.e. you can form social coding and other little groups and they can all kind of intermingle, I think. Minimal yes, as you just do it. You don't have to ask permission. So yeah, that's the 7 of them anyway.
I just want to look at the 7 one more time, maybe. So the first part was the clearly defined boundaries, which was individuals or households who have the rights to withdraw resource units must be clearly defined. So trying to bring this back to the open source context, right? Like in particular forms of licensees, you don't limit that. So I'm trying to think about in the open source context.
You're limiting commercial use on POS, but not on POS.
So open source as okay, it's just one thing. Like open source code as all IP doesn't have competitive consumption, right? Okay. And this I think is a rule that is more like for commons with competitive consumption.
Just quickly on that point, while we're talking about like different licensing models and so forth, I mean, when we're thinking about open source software as IP, like one concept I wanted to bring up quickly is just the Harbinger, I believe, tax model. I don't know if it's a soft or hard G there, but effectively the concept is that you set some kind of, you self-assess the value of some property and pay taxes at that value with the expectation that you should be willing to pay that price for the actual good or service that your property that you're retaining or getting access to. So I think that's a really interesting potential model or like separate license and solves some of what's potentially discussed here.
Awesome. Sorry to go back to the previous point. Clearly defined boundaries, we do have that in open source. We do have it in blockchains because you have a finite amount of attention for maintainers. And so I can't ping a maintainer by calling their cell phone and saying, can you fix this bug? Because they're going to say, screw you, I'm sleeping right now, right? And so instead you have to go through clearly defined boundaries such as open an issue on GitHub or go to my Gitter channel or my Riot channel. And we have to define those collaboratively as a community for what's okay for using the maintainer's bandwidth. Does that make sense?
I think I misinterpreted it now. So the resource unit in this case is really the maintainer's time. Like scarcity of his time. His or her time. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we could probably spend a lot of time just like looking at these. I mean, and it could be a good use of time too, but yeah.
Yeah, kind of part of the reason that I wanted to jump to that topic was because we're just at about the whole Harbinger tax thing is we're at noon now. And so I wanted to kind of try to shift the discussion a bit so that we have enough time to go over it, because I imagine it'll be like pretty popular in terms of how much there's a lot to discuss around sustaining open source software. So I'd like to maybe start by getting people's sort of thoughts on best ways to do that. I mean, for us, obviously, we're looking at bounty models for sustaining open source software. That's one approach. Ellie just had a great talk on this and like different approaches that currently are being pursued. And I think that I'd love to get everyone's perspective on sort of what their view is on the best way to sustain open source or ways that they're seeing implemented currently or that could be implemented that they think are particularly interesting.
I think the best way to maintain open source is probably to actually monetize services on top of the product and then to ask for donations and or a contracting model, which is why I set up a company that helps people do that. So I run Maintainer Mountaineer that explicitly like helps people grow their user bases so that they can then monetize on top of it. That's my answer.
So when you talk about monetizing on top of it, like, does that include providing like some kind of additional proprietary service or like just support or like, so this was something that Ellie talked about in his talk as well. There's a lot of options around monetizing on top of a code base. What in your opinion have been like the most successful ways that you've seen projects do that? And if you have any examples, that'd be really cool too.
Yeah, so the most successful ways are probably going to be actually donation models at this point for the really charismatic leaders. So people like Pharos and Sorhas that set up Patreons that then get a lot of money, or Open Collective. Open Collective works well when you don't have a charismatic leader, but you have a small group of maintainers who actually provide a product that's used by a lot of people. So, for instance, Knock currently gets like $1,000 a month or something for its use. Or there's a Babel. Babel got a lot of money, and now people are able to actually work full time on it because of Open Collective. Open Collective is a website that's basically allowing people to pool PayPal transactions at the end of the day, which is actually pretty cool. So those work really well. Besides that, there's premium models. Read the Docs uses a premium model where you can pay to have better service, or you can pay to have support, period. And then everything else is kind of, yeah, we'll support it as we can, but it's open source, so this is all volunteer run, so we don't really mind if we don't get to you in a month. But if you want us to get to you now, well, then give us some money, which I think is a totally legitimate way of saying capitalism works and we would like to use it. Gitcoin is a good example of another model, but you could talk about that better than I could.
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about that because, like, I feel like that's kind of pitching. But, like, effectively the way it works, I guess, is just that you have a GitHub issue and you can put any sort of ERC20 token towards that as a form of bounty. But ultimately, we see this as one sort of piece of a larger puzzle of sustaining open source. Jordi, I'd be curious to get your thoughts because I know that was a topic that you wanted to talk about earlier, and we're finally at that point.
Here I think it's here we have like for this we have like two different problems, and I think it's good to split them. One is the accountability. Now for all these maintainers, what's the quality of these maintainers? How much work? What's the real work? So how we make an accountable of that? And the other is the funding by itself. Where the money comes from. Okay, so. If we try to, I think that if we try to solve these problems in a split way, in a divide and conquer method, I think we're going to get to do it better. Okay, for the way of accountability, here we can start thinking about quality. Now quality strategies. Things of testing, things of reputation, think of users, that the people that's using this open source ways of signaling feedback, how we can get this information and how can we make some metrics, some measures that can help in knowing how is good, how is bad. And from the funding part, then this is like a different topic for me. It's like here we can start from I think you mentioned here the options: freemium, just collective donations. Here there are different ways. Again, I do not have all the answers, but I think that it should not be difficult to have a system where an open source project that's really creating value to the society should not have problems of funding. So I think this is possible. Maybe it's using the capitalism system, maybe it's using other systems, but I think this is possible. But we need to measure this value that we are adding. So it's not if we are not able to measure the value, it's going to be very difficult to claim it.
Yes, so I think there's that idea we'd all subscribe to is yes, a good project should be able to sustain itself, or should have the money to then sustain it. But I was just thinking before of the other side of the equation is that developer hours are the constrained resource, and based on the individual, if they're sort of more idealistic and more like prioritizing small piecemeal projects and putting aside their stability in some sense, that if they're hopping from one thing to the next until they land a full-time open source gig, which might be quite hard, a lot of those resources are going to get locked into full-time work with traditional companies probably building closed source things. So I just look at that as the other challenge. Like, one thing would be to have the money, absolutely, to be able to provide the same stability, and that would be maybe one way to get them out of that. But I'm not sure what else can disrupt that model around getting people out. Like, I don't know, thawing these people who are trapped inside full-time work to contribute to the good things in a stable way.
So that's a really good point. And funding a single person working on a single project is a whole different ballgame than, say, funding something like Node, right? So how do you do that? And so there's different models that are working right now. So some of them are foundational models where you set up a voting structure where large sponsors can then donate thousands of dollars towards the development of a community, which then actually works by, I don't want to use the word exploiting in a bad way, but by having a lot of maintainers come and use their free time to do it without having properly getting paid for that, but instead it's just offloaded to the entire community. Another way to think about it, if you're pitching it to your manager, if you're pitching it up higher in the company, right, is open source is a loss leader for your company. So what it is that you're actually losing developer hours, but what you're gaining is developer incentives. So people want to stay on the project and they want to stay at your company because they've been given half their time to work on open source. Or alternatively, you can say, we're such a great company, we do open source, right? Microsoft has clued onto this in a big way recently, where they're like, hey, if we just do open source stuff, everyone will like us again. And it seems to be working, right? Like it's everyone loves Microsoft now. And so if you do that, actually from an advertising model and from the idea that you can then hire top talent, and even more, you can hire top talent who've already been part of your community, who already know your code base. You don't have to onboard people who have been donating their time. It's almost like a no-brainer from a managerial perspective if you're a large company. If you're a small person or you're a mid-level, it's a lot more difficult. And this sort of comes back to the, well, all important projects should be maintained, but should comes with it expectations. And where those expectations come from and where they end is kind of the ambiguous hard bit. So.
I'm very new to this open source space. I've been indoctrinated by Boki Puba to put all my things open, so it's been a really interesting 9 months. I come from the big data space, and so in the machine learning, so we have like 3 big players, Cloudera, Hortonworks, and so they do open source for Apache Hadoop and Spark and all these projects. And so in their space, you know, you have these multi-billion-dollar companies who are maintaining effectively a shared code base, but they have this like multi-billion-dollar incentive to develop this product. I'm just curious what your thoughts about like a project like Hadoop and Spark and how that would relate to some of the projects that we are all trying to build.
Well, just yeah, I think the responsibility. You know, I think this is very important. You know, and I don't know how to do it but when you are using an open source project, you should be aware that you are using an open source project, and you just contribute. I think so. For me, at least, I like the donation model in that sense, because at the end is the best model if it happens. But I think it's for me it's the awareness. So I am sure right now I feel that there are a lot of open source projects that are doing an incredible work, and you know the people is using those open source processes and they don't even have the awareness of the work, or even the people that's behind there, or that what's implied. So for me, at least, having a system that, so if a company, you know, I would say if a company, a for-profit company, is using an open source software for free, that's great. It's open source. They can use it. But I would love that they at least have awareness. Okay, you are using an open source project, and what you really, at least you will contribute on that would be that. Of course, it's open source. You can do whatever you want. But at least having this awareness, having this number, having this, you know, this accountability, this accounting system, I think this is important. Or at least this is the first step. How much we have to charge on that.
Just quickly on that, I just want to add that, like, yeah, awareness is super important. I think that the quintessential example of that, which I always bring up and many people bring up, is OpenSSL, right? Which really everyone uses. Like, it's probably one of the most popular open source projects, and really no one actually thought about it until Heartbleed happened, and then suddenly everyone cared about it quite a bit because it had caused billions of dollars of losses. And so in those cases, I'm not sure how you like manage that without a donation model or some kind of incentive for open source in particular. Like I like the idea of having especially and Nadia makes this distinction going back to her sort of work between open source applications and open source infrastructure. I think the sort of model that you're describing with having services on top of a business or on top of an open source project make a lot of sense in the context of applications, but in the infrastructure layer like OpenSSL, I can't imagine there being like a model that would work for them where they would offer like an enterprise service, because it's just such a critical piece of infrastructure.
Yeah, so in that case, it would be more like using the developer's time for other things and saying, I can only work part-time in this, in which case it's up to the maintainer to say, here's my expectations for how much work I have, which is really hard because humans are really bad at setting boundaries with other humans. Going back to your statement that people should be aware, there's a couple of projects that are working on that. So like libraries.io has a huge dependency graph. Back Your Stack, I think, might use that dependency graph, which is like another project, I think, by Open Collective right now to figure out what your stack is and like what you're actually using. It doesn't help with things like Heartbleed, which is like in Chrome, but then, there's things like Mozilla, and so people are getting more aware over time, and we're getting there, and we have projects to make that happen. Yeah.
I don't know if it's possible, and that's just ongoing thought. But for example, I'm going back a little bit to the licenses. So can exist an open source licenses where you are just forcing to the users of this open source that at least they give awareness. So they know. So you have to publish that I'm using that. So that's the only obligation you have. But you have to tell us that you are using that and you are making that your whatever, your field, that form or something like that. Just, of course, it's the same model. It's open source, whatever, but you are using that, so you have the obligation to just account that you are using that. If we have I think this is a good.
But yeah, well, attribution being the word, but surely they have that in their metrics. So it's up to the software provider providing the software to create the attribution metrics to find out where their users came from and where they downloaded, who's got what, and how many of them. But it seems like a pretty standard thing in most code, but I'm not sure about open source, I gotta admit.
I don't want to put Ellie on the spot here, but I'm very curious. I mean, we've been talking a lot about sustainability. You just had a really good talk about it. If you want to maybe spend a few minutes and explain it.
Yeah, so in short, we're going full crazy, but in a longer format. So where we started was with this idea that indeed, we have applications and libraries, and I also come from the big data world. To answer your question, for something like Hadoop and all of these things, you can charge around it, right? Like for libraries, it actually doesn't work that well, and libraries are the backbone of the internet. So, you basically, what would you say? That I'm going to put one function, behind the paywall, and then the rest will be free. So that model doesn't work there. So where we started is actually, and what we do with OSCoin is we saw in cryptocurrencies a different way to finance open source, and we got very excited with Bitcoin because we saw in Bitcoin a way to reward value producers within a network. And of course, you have to enumerate them to do that, right? Which is what proof of work is. But we started from that, and then at some point in 2016, we started seeing other currencies like DAS or Zcash, where they took the same idea and they said, you know what? We're minting a few new tokens and we're distributing them to our value producers. Okay. On Bitcoin, these value producers were only the miners. Okay. Now, but Zcash said that we are also value producers. Human work. There is human work in decentralized networks. So what they came up with is they came up with what they call founders reward, and at every block they mint a few new tokens, and then a few of these new tokens go to the Zcash Foundation, which is a centralized body that then further deploys that capital towards their community. DAS took the same idea, but now they had the same idea, but in a decentralized fashion, and they use coin voting, and I spoke about that on my talk. It's fascinating. It's very problematic from a game theoretic point of view that, you, with my tokens, I support your city library, you support my city library, and then we both make money somehow, and we cheat the system, right? So that's a tragedy of the commons again. But we started seeing people experimenting with this thing. So where we ended up with this thought process was that what if we actually try to create a network for developers to come in and collaborate around code that now has also economic primitives around that. You can think of it as a peer-to-peer alternative to GitHub and GitLab, right? And I know that it sounds crazy, but we're pursuing this. And now there's in our thinking, there's a currency behind that that you can use to transact within that network. And then this currency is, again, we're minting it at every block, and some of these new tokens go towards the validators, miners that provide infrastructure, and a small portion of these tokens go back to the community towards the open source projects, right? So you can think of it as an open source tax, okay? What if we had a cryptocurrency that some of the newly minted tokens were going all towards open source, right? So that's where we started. And then now the question remains on how do you actually go and allocate. Let's say you had, like, I don't know what Bitcoin does these days, but it's on the millions again, rewards, right? What if, let's say we had $1 million a month, okay? Let's make it very simple to give to open source. Still, there's the question, how do you do that, right? How do you enumerate? Where do you give that? So we started looking at different things like, you know, coin voting type of stuff, but they're very problematic. And then where we ended up with, and that's the direction that we're exploring right now, is we end up back to dependencies. So we were like, what actually if we try to create a canonical way for you to specify your dependencies, and then we're using this dependency graph and we're using something similar to PageRank to actually go and, if we had 1 million, to basically distribute that to different open source projects based on their PageRank. And that's the vision we're pursuing. And in that vision, there are two pieces of work. There's one which we call Radical, and it's a peer-to-peer network for code collaboration, and it has some nice properties that we can talk about, but not so interesting. And then on the other side, has a currency that you can use now to transact within that network, and a small portion of that currency at every block goes back to open source using something like PageRank that Lexi called it, which my co-founder calls it SourceRank for now. That's the idea. It's a wild idea. It's a wild project. It's just a very different take on financing open source. Yeah. OS coin. Yeah.
In general, I really like that idea of finding ways to fund down a dependency graph because of how important it is to actually, you know, this ability to understand what you're using. The awareness component is very challenging, and I think that if you just have people get funding through a dependency graph, or for that to be part of the system, it kind of alleviates or makes it easier to get those people funding without people necessarily knowing every dependency that they're using. So I think that what you're doing on that front is really cool. The other one I'll give a shout out to is Dandelion with SourceCred. Again, like libraries.io is fantastic and is like the backbone for a lot of these projects. And like the fact that we have that data is great, and like we really should be making use of it. So I'm glad that we're starting to see that.
So we have like 3 minutes left. I kind of want to go back through a lot of the resources and things that we've talked about, and just like for everyone who's interested, could you remind me the name of the book that you... Eleanor Ostrom's Governing the Commons. That was a book that was referenced. We talked about the cathedral and the bazaar. Nadia's work, which is the lemonade stand, and she also, the talk was rebuilding the cathedral. Yep, a really good blog by Nadia.
If anyone's interested, tomorrow in London there's Sustain, which is a conference that happens like once a year for sustaining open source. I'm going to be there. You guys all going to be there?
We'll have some people there. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so that happens. We had it last year in San Francisco. Now we're having it in London. We had a pop-up last year in London. We're also open source in our management, so if you want to help out, jump on. It'd be super sweet. But yeah, that's a really cool conference, though. To watch what comes out of it is fun if you can't be there. Yep. Every year, so we take up all the notes and write them up and then try to make a nice PDF. So sustainoss.org.
Yep.
I think just to finish, like I'm a wallflower in this space. I'd love to contribute, but I've never been able to actually, take the leap. And just one of the questions that I have for you guys is like, how do you incentivize other people to, you obviously have 2 or 3 champions in a project or maintainers. How do you incentivize or make it accessible for someone to put a line or put a...
So we're thinking a lot about that at Gitcoin. We're doing bounties on different projects, specifically by the GitHub issue, anything specific that you can build out, whether it be a feature or helping with a bug or doing something new on a project. So that's a subset that we can talk more about if you want. Cheers.
Awesome. Yeah, one closing thought.
What one ask is because I think has been amazing. Right now my mind is blown because I think a lot of resources and a lot of things has happened if we can write just a gist with the links, just the links of everything that happens here, yeah, or whatever, just something, a tweet, just with the links that just because I think that it's like this conversation that takes some time to mature.
Griff can send that out to everybody, and I'll make sure that Griff gets it. But I'm VCing do things. So, anyways, we can. Yeah, but we can. I'll get it from Griff, and we can get it figured out. It's a lot harder to spell. The lemonade, Nadia Egba. Yeah, and if anyone else has other resources that they'd like to recommend while we're here, I mean, yeah, Egba. There's some other ones we were talking about, right? Oh. Like the Richard Stallman stuff, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of older work as well that's like still super relevant from the Richard Stallman days. Obviously, his writing is like really influential, and like you might sit on one side or the other of like his arguments, but like he's a really good person to get perspective from. And I think that other than that, I mean, we'll compile a large list. Actually, that's a good idea, and like we'll share that with everyone. And I think that's a good starting point. To continue this conversation. But thanks, guys, for being part of this, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
So it's like tragedy to commons. So it's the same problem where the empire hasn't fed back into Hadoop, but instead made their own thing.
Just in case the live stream wants to listen in. Actually, I didn't ask you about this before, but like Miko, like talk a bit about like that project that you guys are working on. Super cool.
Yeah, so the idea there is to sort of, so you have the concept of Gitcoins, where you can have like incentivization for like performing these small tasks, and the idea is so you have the concept of a DICO, so sort of a managed version of a DAO sort of structure, or a DAO linked to an ICO. So the idea was to sort of create a wrapper around Gitcoin that sort of acts like more like I wouldn't call it a management layer, but sort of a like structuring like a group of these issues together, but adding the extra functionality, because we were in the discussion earlier, people were talking about like incentivation built into a protocol, like you sort of mint extra tokens
that are rewarded to either an association or like a foundation that sort of supports a project. It was sort of a similar idea that for each issue that gets funded and gets gets executed, that you would also like mint project tokens for that specific project, and so thereby like adding a reward model, not only to the people that actually are funding that issue. So it's sort of, it's like an ICO model in the sense that people that are actually sending in crypto to fund the project, they receive a project token in return, right? So it's an ICO model, but it's more gradual. So it's like it's continuously wrapped around all the contributions that are being done on one project, and that's sort of the idea. But it's really pretty simple. It's actually just a sort of Trello board wrapped around the functionality of a fund. So you can sort of fund the cards on the Trello board. That's basically it. But with the additional feature that instead of just managing it, whatever goes through that board creates tokens as a reward, not only for the people that are sponsoring the issues, so the sort of the investors in the project, but also the people that actually contribute. So the person actually doing that Gitcoin issue in this case, he would also get like a portion of these minted tokens. So he gets, so both parties get rewarded, sort of. Yeah, that was the idea.
Yeah, thank you. And how do you spell the project name?
So there are currently like two iterations going on. So one is it's called EatCan, so it's based on WeCan, and so there's now they're like requesting for getting some grants to actually execute the project. But it's more generic in the sense that it's not a wrapper around Gitcoin as such. It's just like a generic thing where you can create issues and you can fund them. And there's like a second iteration called MICO, which is an abbreviation of the Meritocratic ICO. Yeah, so MICO project it's called. I can send you the link later. And that's, so the purpose there is it's similar. So it's also like a Trello board style. But instead of just like self-creating these cards, it's just a wrapper around Gitcoin. And the idea there is that you can also leverage like the community that's already on Gitcoin. So from the perspective from like somebody who just want to collaborate, it just comes on Gitcoin, and so he can either do like a traditional Gitcoin issue, where he will get some ERC20 token or some ETH for that. Or they also could like take on one of these issues, execute it, and not only would they get like the rewards that's on Gitcoin, but additionally to the same address, they will receive some project tokens for that project. That's the idea. Yeah.
Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, good.
Oh, did you have a point? Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe just a quick Gitcoin question. Are there sort of attributes or skill attributes associated, like tags maybe, to say this ticket is a technical one, or this ticket is around content, or this one is around solidity? Is there some pre-classification of tickets?
Yeah, currently we kind of classify them just very broadly by, so is this a feature? Is this just a general improvement? Is this sort of like documentation related? Is it related to the like security of the project in some way? We're definitely looking to make, and we do sort of like generally describe, is this something you feel is like kind of intermediate difficulty, advanced difficulty, just so that people are sort of aware of what they're walking into. Yeah, we also give them like a rough time estimate. So we say like, you know, the bounty is good for 3 months. We expect it to take, you know, in the range of days or weeks or, you know, and so forth. So that gives people some context. Yeah, because, and you know, everyone that actually uses the project, like we want to make sure that they actually understand how to spec out issues properly. So we work with them really closely, because that's a big open source problem. Yeah, well, and not just that, but like often you won't have proper acceptance criteria, you won't have proper like detailing of an issue, and that leads to people not really understanding, like especially like new contributors, what they should be working on. So just trying to make sure that there's that specification so that people can jump in and like become like proficient pretty quickly with the repo and understand what the requirements are. Often that gets lost in like the rush of like just putting up 1,000 different issues. So we work with maintainers pretty closely on that front.
I don't know if I'm taking it from another topic, but Yeah, I think for people new to open source, I think Adrian was that example, saying, well, I don't know where to begin, where can I contribute a line of code? There's also perhaps a bit of fear or a bit of, like, the first time you do something openly, it's a bit intimidating. And perhaps also to subscribe to a ticket and say, oh, I want to do this ticket. If that's immediately publicly visible, that could be a bit of an intimidation, because you're saying, oh, I want to do this, but maybe you're not ready to start it. But perhaps a way of having like a soft start where you can privately start it. And if you get to doing a bit, then you can go and say, okay, now share. And that way you can have a bit of a dry run for contributing. You'll know what it looks like. You know what you're in for. I think that'll just help other new people ease into it. Just a thought.
Yeah, I like that idea. In general, just providing clear, like the way that that's sort of done now, I guess, is like in just providing clear guidelines, like a contributing.md doc and so forth. But like having an actual like run through of some kind would be great. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So on one of the panels yesterday, I think it was on the Aragon presentation. So the talk was about like also opening up accountability for like spending funds, right? So that everything's out in the open. I think it sort of relates to what you said. Like, I think it's difficult for people to just like jumpstart in that mode, and I think certainly when it's about like dealing with money, I think that's. Yeah, I mean, there's sort of this taboo, like I'm not like telling you or asking you how much you earn, like what's your wage. I mean, it's sort of a social thing that you're not like all that open about that, and I think it's sometimes might be a long stretch for people to expect for someone who wants to collaborate on that to be immediately so open about that. So now, of course, it's difficult because like either you're public about it or you're not. There's no way in between. You also, it's not sustainable if like a few people are open on it and other people are not open on it. But I'm just wondering, so in theory it's okay. I mean, those things technically will work, right? My only question would be, is everybody going to accept it, and isn't it going to be like or is it going to restrain like the sort of the contribution of people? So if you're like, okay, I might have the skills and the capabilities to contribute like spending money for a project. I might do that in an efficient way, but I might be too sort of too scared of the repercussions by publishing whatever I'm doing, you know? Does that make sense?
So you're kind of talking to the point of how do you have this transparency while also protecting, like, I mean, I guess, you know, this goes back to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I'll ask it in a question format, so it might be clear. So I think there's an opportunity for, if you collaborate on open source, to sort of gradually roll into that, because you can start by doing a very small issue. Like, I could sort of do a pull request and correct a typo in a README file, for example. That's very like, I mean, the risk for me for screwing up is very low, but I'm already starting to build up some credibility in a community, right? Using the tools, but like directly managing money for a project, like it sort of seems like a much bigger responsibility and a much bigger risk for being taken accountable for spending someone else's money. So that would be my question. So is there a way of doing that sensibly with money from a project? Like, is there some sort of onboarding process or a ramp up where people could participate? Because I see that in open source. Would it also work in with the financials of a project? That would be my question, you know?
I mean, I think it definitely could. I definitely like the idea in open source of having contributors sort of start small with projects, and we sort of encourage that, so that, you know, you get a handle on what the code base is like, you understand sort of what you need to do, and it makes it way easier for the contributor down the road to work on larger issues. And eventually, like, the goal there is like that they can become maintainers of the project or like core contributors. But in the case of like funding transparency, like, I mean, I guess like there's not really a skill barrier there in the same way, I guess, like to be transparent about like how your project is spending money. So like I would actually argue
that like being fully transparent about finances from like the start is like almost always the best option in my mind, unless there's like some serious like security risk in specifying certain line items or something, like if you're revealing some like serious like problem that like is a threat to like the overall business model. That being said, like that threat should be something that's like not just to do with, oh, like it will look bad for the company or it's some kind of it has some negative repercussion. It should be like something serious on like a common scale, like at like a community level. And I don't see like in 99% of cases like that probably isn't necessary. Like it's probably not that critical. So that would be my perspective on it.
Going to the point around the sort of easy tasks and working your way up. I mean, I'm guessing there'll be psychologists that will hear a lot of our conversations and go, yeah, this is how you do it, kind of thing. And you know, gamification of it, like fixing a typo. And I think even prior to that first kind of active engagement is attending, like logging in, visiting. You've read 3 issues, get a little badge, bing, get a little neurons fire, or what do you call that? The dopamine reward, is it? When you like sort of like the likes, when you hear the bing, you hear the pop, and then people get that response. It's almost the same thing. Maybe you want to clock up the rewards for logging in, rewards for reading them, then a reward for doing it. And then something in the education system in Australia, and again, it's nothing new, it's called differentiated learning. So within the one classroom, you have a blend of abilities, and you want to somehow cater for all of them. And what I've done before with sort of technical content for non-technical people is just having sort of like a terrain of knowledge available. So there are low entry barrier things, and then there are more complex things, all available to everyone who can access it. And just to bring that into, say, the Gitcoin model, just knowing there is that diverse range of bounties is almost the supply side of a two-sided marketplace. And showing that there's rewards for this level. You know, you're on level 1, log in 2 more times, you get level 2. Oh, do your first typo fix, you get this badge. And then you can show in advance maybe the path. And if someone wants to just immediately level up, maybe they just do it more quickly. They do the grind work because they don't mind. They'll quickly level up. I don't know, that could be an external thing, like a plugin that someone adds over the top of that.
You could also look at verified claims, given that there's loads of places spitting them out, like futurelearn.com and stuff like that. So that's a handy accreditation. Your Gitcoin, is it? Yeah, so I like that idea. I've just come in late.
For sure, yeah. I wanted to also introduce you guys. So we have someone here from Colony as well. Colony is a really cool project in this space that is, you know, doing some interesting work in this area. Actually, I believe, what project are you working on, actually? I'm curious. Okay. I was like, you actually seemed familiar, and I was like, not sure if you were actually part of... Okay, that's possible. A thing previously. Okay. Yeah, one sec. I'll let you.
I just want to jump in real quick because you were talking about like skill sets and particular categories, and also earning badges, and talking about like credibility and accessibility and things like that to particular tasks. And yeah, I mean, I think within the open source community, if there is some sort of way to establish some sort of credibility on like what skill level you're at, it definitely helps gain that trust when you're trying to work on larger issues, especially if it's dealing with security or tokens or financial exchanges or some sort. And so one thing that Colony is doing is we're building a reputation system, and we're building out these tasks, and you're gaining a reputation when you're earning the tasks, and we're looking for other projects to collaborate with and work with, and potentially modularize our reputation system and find ways that people can build reputations within a particular domain or with a particular skill set, which gives them some sort of credibility to gain access to maybe more difficult tasks or issues or things like that. So just wanted to put that 2 cents in there because we really like what Gitcoin's doing. We've like looking on ways to collaborate with them, and we're also doing our own thing. Everyone's kind of entering the space from different angles and shooting for the same thing. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, so I work for Swarm City for the project, and yeah, so it might be interesting to like to add to the conversation how we look towards reputation and identity, because we sort of so the statement that we are making is that your identity is sort of the sum of all your actions within a certain context, and I'll I'll quickly elaborate on what we mean by that. Is that so you as an individual, we think it's very difficult to have something like an overall reputation, because like your behavior depends on the situation where you're in. Like if I would be like in a very like in a business context, for example, I would probably behave different to people than if I'm after my sport event, I go to the bar and I behave in a totally different way. And so the actions that I perform like in the bar might be counterproductive if I would perform the same actions like in that business context, and vice versa. So I think in the reality is that people already so in their lives they have some sort of different identities depending, sort of circles, right? And so in that sense, so you could say like reputation, if you want to combine reputation throughout these different circles, we say like it's difficult, because like what's good in that context might be bad in another context. So does that add to your global reputation, or does it decrease your global reputation? So we tend to say like, okay, you can just have like different identities, so you can literally have like different accounts in different marketplaces in Swarm City. And instead of like tracking reputation, so having other people vote on whether an action was good or bad for your reputation, we just say no, this is just a sum of all your actions. Whatever you've done is like a positive point sort of in your reputation in that specific context, in that circle. So, and I don't know if that's resonates with the way you guys are looking into that.
It definitely resonates. One way that the reputation, the way that the reputation works within Colony is there's the meta colony, which is basically the entire network, which you're gaining a reputation and getting reputation points deducted from, as well as within each individual colony, which is representative of an organization or a community of some sort. And then also you're gaining reputation within domains that are built within each organization, and you're also gaining reputation within a particular skill, which is part of the whole network. So essentially, if you're a JavaScript developer and you're completing an issue in JavaScript, you could gain reputation within that skill, which is recognized in the entire network. And that goes towards your reputation within the organization, which you're contributing to as well. And if that's within a domain, it goes to that domain as well. But it's allowing you to, one, kind of gain ownership and become part of this open organization within a particular domain, but also gaining skills and recognition. So if you want to work within multiple organizations, you're able to transfer over that reputation, and people can recognize it within other domains. I really like the idea of multiple identities, and that's something I need to think about a little bit more, but I would love to continue the conversation on that.
Cool. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, sure.
You were talking earlier about like sort of stepping up, some sort of a ladder of like how do you maybe leveling up. Yeah, leveling up. Yeah. So one of the sort of the underlying ideas how we sort of created or organizing the Swarm City project is inspired by the book of Rick Valkvinge, which is called Swarmwise. And Swarmwise from Rick Valkvinge, the creator of the Pirate Party. Yeah. So he describes a model how to like organize like a sort of an open source group of people. So they applied it to start like a political party. So they sort of apply an open source model into creating that. So it's also interesting to see that. So for like funding all that stuff that needs to be done, he actually encourages like the offloading of all these tasks to like a large crowd of people. So instead of going to a print shop to have like all these the flyers printed out, they just send around the PDFs, and they ask everybody just to print like 10 copies on their own printer. So they really offload all the costs and the work to the. So that's how they work. But it's also interesting for like stepping up on that ladder is that he suggests to sort of create an organigram of your organization, but make it empty. So create a structure, but don't fill in any names. And then everybody can collaborate, so they don't have to ask permission to start collaborating on doing any of these tasks. But he provides like the framework to say like this is how it should be structured, but we're not there yet. And so at a certain point, somebody will start acting upon a certain task, and then other people will suggest him or like push him forward to say, yeah, his name should be there on the organigram, right? And that's how it works. And then if that person starts to get like less involved in the project, like you see like sort of erosion in open source too, that people contribute for a while and then their interest diverts away, and so they stop being active or they get less active in a project. It's the same thing. So their name will disappear from the organigrams because there's someone else stepping up and taking over these tasks. But it's the interesting thing is that it becomes sort of clear for newcomers because they can see the organigram, but it's not like there's no single person assigning names to the organigram. It's just, but it provides some clarity towards newcomers where they should go to, so they know, like, I want to contribute something like in the PR department, so to speak, so they directly know how to who to go to. So it's pretty. So it's sort of a non enforced organization model, sort of that provides some clarity for newcomers, and I also think that's pretty interesting.
I watched that talk by regarding Swarmwise, and I think he, as well as I didn't know about that placement thing, so that's really good to know. But also just having the kind of array of tasks just sort of up there, just to say, hey, we need flyers. Here's a task, and again, that was probably what Gitcoin looks like. Just an array of tasks up there that people can grab. I was going to say something else about the ramp point as well. Can't remember now. Damn it! Sorry, lost it. But yeah, I'll pass on the mic then.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, the entire concept of flat organizations or just like very free-form organizations is very interesting. Like the concept that we talk a lot about in Gitcoin, because like it's sort of what we facilitate in some ways, or what open source in general has facilitated, is like this ability to create flash organizations and like to have these sort of emergent entities that are sort of created for a particular task and sort of like like pop up for some very small period of time and then like submerge again, and it's just sort of this constant like flow of different smaller organizations that coordinate as needed. I think this is probably almost like, to go more philosophical, like the way that organizational structures are moving, like, and you can see this over time from like even like the early 1900s, like from like these large corporations to these much more fluid and more dynamic smaller organizations that may not even have like a formal corporate structure, like as we're seeing in this space. Like you may just have a DAO or some other kind of software entity managing that process. I think that's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, I sort of went from mostly engineering jobs, which were sort of pretty much full-time jobs, and then when I started contracting, then I got the sense of that fluidity and dynamic as an individual, and I did this project where I was doing the tech support for another industry, which was around filming and advertising, but they were doing a lot of cool tech with the advertising kind of thing they were presenting. And in that community, people were just so used to that swarm together for a moment and then disperse. And I just literally, I'm visualizing swarms, the way an individual or a group of people will join together, look like one big thing, do that, but then just dissipate again and just go somewhere else and then reform a different shape, a different direction, and push in a certain way. And just to see that in that other industry, and that was just the norm for them, was quite an eye-opener for me. And to go from, again, I think of the personas out there, that people who are comfortable with full-time work and perhaps only know full-time work would be like, this is scary. And but we maybe we're used to it, we've seen it, we're so used to that dynamic. But
just briefly, you see it in Hollywood all the time when people come together to put movies together, and then they go apart, they go their separate ways, and then they reap the benefits of that entity that they created. They have equity, they have salaries, but then they walk away and then they do their next thing. So yeah.
So there are two models that are interesting. Are you guys familiar with Dash? Yeah, Dash. So Dash is a treasury model, right? Whereby 10% of all coins go to a treasury. And what's interesting is that anyone can put projects on, right? It can be a wallet. So someone can say, hey, I want to be a wallet, right? And people can vote to see whether they want a wallet or not, right? Or they can, the funny ones like can be a Twitter campaign, can be like advertising, or can be like, hey, I want to do an event, in like in some random, in like Zimbabwe or something, and then people actually vote to say yes, right? It's just really interesting stuff. It's actually interesting because like in the bounty system that Gitcoin does, right? It is like we are kind of assuming that the corporation knows what to do, right? And knows how to prioritize, right? But over here, I think what's interesting is that is that the community kind of decides what is a priority, and they vote with the pocket, So I think that model is actually interesting. I haven't seen that around that much, but I think we should though. It's actually a very interesting model, right? Whereby some part of the ICO proceeds or whatever and stuff goes to a much more it's interesting because the centralized party can still control most of the funds, but I think it's reasonable to have some part of that goes to a community. I think it's a good balance. Yeah, and I think the other I think and then another model that I've seen that I'm actually setting up right now. Interestingly, part of that is a model whereby so we are getting a lot of different projects to come together, right? To do an initiative, right? So usually we will need a non-profit, right? But we're actually doing a DAO, right? And it's actually very interesting to see how many projects, very prominent projects, right? Kind of like be very very comfortable with the process, right? Actually they prefer that process because there is no a legality to it, right? Just okay, we have everyone get their private keys and we just decide who to push and make approvals and stuff. So I think that it's also very interesting to see that how people in the space are so comfortable, with setting up new structures and stuff. It's really cool.
So I think we do need to wrap up now. We have less than 1 minute left, but thanks all for being part of the discussion. This is sort of, I guess, like an after discussion from the open source discussion. And if you haven't already, grab lunch. There is some food in the in the venue.
Resources that you think we should share? We've kind of compiled a lot of things from the conversation.
Yeah, there's actually an active Twitter thread now that is going through some of those links. There'll also be we'll be compiling a list. I'm putting that out there as well. Awesome. Perfect. Great. Thanks, guys.
You're so sweet, Scott. Thank you so much. Was it a good talk? Well, we will edit this video. Hopefully we can edit this video and actually just cut out this piece, and you can put a bunch of links in the YouTube video if it feels like it flows. We'll figure out how to do that.
That sounds good.
Yeah, we used to be really generous with giving people management access to our YouTube, so now we're not going to do that. But yeah, but we'll figure out something. Yeah, unfortunately. Well, hopefully we're gonna we'll still have YouTube because that's where the viewers are, but we're gonna move to Live Peer and have some other solution. Kai will be all over it. He's been running Live Peer nodes for a couple months now. Yeah. So yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. Seriously, it was amazing. Yeah. And so our next talk is going to be about why decentralized data is important. I think you're gonna how are you gonna start this off, Jay?
I was gonna have a short video, maybe 3 or 4 minute video, just to try to explain where I come from, about what I find most interesting about this space. And then I was gonna hand out a handout. I have some printouts that will say about 20 different semi-controversial things, and hopefully we can get into a little bit of argument. That's my goal.
Okay. That sounds amazing. So let's see if we can get the AV going. Excellent. Ooh. Okay, so for this, that's awesome. Wow, your video has a lot of views. No. So I think for this, we'll want to put the sound will. Can we test where the sound is coming from? Can you just hit play and let's see if it comes from the computer or this thing?
What's your name? Would you like to join us? Would you guys like to join us? Argue. Okay, argue. Sure. Huh? Hopefully. So my name is Jay Rush. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, my name is Jay Rush. I have a project called True Blocks, and I was involved in not very early, but kind of early in late 2015, early 2016. And back then, people were writing smart contracts that were purposefully without an owner purposely without a controller, and they were exploring what it meant to build software that no one controlled except for everyone controlling the software. And that was the DAO contract for me for the most part. And at a certain point, people, I think, became a little afraid, and they introduced something called the curators into the DAO smart contract. And to me, that kind of lost the vision of what I thought we were building, which was an uncontrollable, immutable, non-upgradable piece of software that everyone had to agree to prior to joining, and then work within the constraints of that piece of software. Introducing the curators to the DAO changed the dynamic, and it introduced an owner or a controller of that smart contract, and then I thought something got lost. So my goal here is to try to explain what that looks like or what that means or what that is, and then I want to I have a handout that I'm going to give out. It has 20 or 30 different, I call them mantras, where I try to express that feeling that what we could be building is software that can't be controlled. And what happens, what kind of a world do we live in where the software can't be controlled? So hopefully those mantras are somewhat controversial, and I want to try to have a conversation where we possibly argue about these mantras. That my work is all driven by my belief that we can build software that can't be controlled, and what does it look like, and how does that behave? So I'm going to show a short video where I kind of try to get to exactly the point that I believe blockchains for the first time allow us to reach what John Nash would call an equilibrium that's a different thing than the regular operation of human beings in a group, and we can behave in a group in a way that's different, and I think blockchains allow us to try to reach to that goal. And then I want to talk about that for a tenth of a second, then I'll hand out these handouts and we can argue, okay? So hopefully we'll be able to hear this.
Yes, you might want to stop shuffling your papers for 5 seconds.
I will not buy you gentlemen beer.
Oh, we're not here for beer, my friend.
Does anyone else feel she should be moving in slow motion?
Will she want a large wedding cake?
Should we say swords, gentlemen? Pistols at dawn?
Have you remembered nothing? Recall the lessons of Adam Smith, father of modern economics.
In competition, individual ambition serves the common good.
Exactly.
Every man for himself, gentlemen. Yeah, and those who strike out are stuck with their friends.
I'm not going to strike out.
You can lead a blonde to water, but...
I'll just pause it for a tenth of a second, okay? This guy here is John Nash, if you're not familiar with this movie. He is the founder of a thing called... This guy here is John Nash. He's the founder of an idea called game theory, basically. I think back in the late 50s. And this is supposed to be the moment when he realizes what that means, what it means to for people to reach the best solution to certain problems. They have to act in their own best interests and the best interests of the group at exactly the same time. And that, I think, is what you can do with smart contracts if they're well written. So that's why I wanted to show you this. But there's also a comment. As soon as he has his realization, there's a comment by another guy that I want you to pay attention to as well. And this drives my work, the comment that this guy makes. So let's try to, I just wanted to interrupt for a second.
You can't make a drink.
I don't think he said that.
All right, nobody move. She's looking over now. All right, she's looking.
We block each other. Not a single one of us is going to get her. So then we go for her friends. But they will all give us the cold shoulder because nobody likes to be second choice. But what if no one goes for the blonde? We don't get in each other's way. And we don't insult the other girls. That's the only way we win. That's the only way we all get laid. Smith said, the best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself, right? That's what he said, that's right? Incomplete. Incomplete. Okay? Because the best result would come from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself and the group.
Ash, this is some way for you to get the blonde on your own. You can go to hell.
Governing dynamics, gentlemen. Governing dynamics. Adam Smith. Who's wrong?
All right, so I'm just going to stop there. So he says Adam Smith was wrong. So for 300 years, we've believed that a marketplace, which is what Adam Smith talked about, naturally materializes in the best outcome for the entire population. That's what Adam Smith said. And John Nash concludes that that's not complete. It's incomplete. There's more to it, that we can do even better than that by also cooperating at the same time. As soon as he has that realization and makes that comment, this other guy says, he basically says, are you trying to cheat? Are you trying to take advantage? Are you trying to get me to go along with your vision so that you can take advantage of the situation? And this is exactly the reason why human beings pull back away from a suggestion that we should work together, because we're worried that someone else can take advantage. Because we see in the system that we could take advantage, and we know that if we can take advantage, another person can take advantage. And then we have to trust that other person. So blockchains let us write software that removes entirely the need to trust the other side of the deal, if you've written the software well, and you don't put something like an owner into the software, because an owner can do special things. So this is my driving influence. This is what I'm trying to enable, trying to make more obvious to people, trying to help people come to the realization that we can do this. And for me, that means everybody has to have equal access to all the data that's available all the time. So that's what TrueBlocks is basically about, is running your own node and getting the data directly for yourself. It's kind of a pipe dream. It's kind of a ridiculous situation because it's really, really hard. But that's where I'm coming from. So let me hand out now what I call mantras for decentralized data. This is a list of about 30 things that I've been thinking about for the last 2 years that just try to push buttons a little bit so that people start thinking about this kind of issue. And then we can have that conversation about this issue, about trust, about what are we building, why are we building it, and so forth. So, can someone join me on this side of the thing so I don't feel like I'm all alone over here?
Yeah, no problem. Jordi, you want in on this? Here, I'll take one. Actually, we need a couple. Yeah, can you? That would be awesome if it was up on the screen. Should we just like each read one of these or something?
So I went to this discussion by this guy that's a world expert on how to get groups to talk, and he told me that the best way to get groups to talk is to give them something to read for 3 minutes before the talk, so that everybody has the same sort of ideas in their head for the talk. So just go ahead and spend the next 2 or 3 minutes reading, and I will put it up on the screen so we can show it to the web, and then we'll have our conversation. So just so we don't have too much dead air, can I ask, do you guys want to come and join the circle a little bit? Or maybe you don't? You're good where you're at, that's fine. Would you like to come? Come join the circle. Okay, we're all good. I'm not necessarily convinced that I believe every one of these things, but I say them just to, it's kind of the way I think, and it always comes back to this idea that I want to try to make the data accessible enough so that people can get over the hump of not trusting each other. That's kind of what I would be with the basic idea of what I'm trying to do. So does anyone react positively or negatively to any of these statements? Or?
Yeah, so I think the point I'm trying to make is sort of embedded or can be applicable to different. So it's in general about the openness of data. So I agree with most of the statements that I see here in the sense that, like, for example, where was it that you should be able to sort of start serving the immutable data. I don't know exactly which point it was. Trying to make it easier to get the data or something. Yeah, so anyway, so it doesn't really matter because like what I'm about to say applies to everything or a lot of these things. It's about, if you look at licensing for data, so you see a lot of like companies licensing, having other people to pay to get access to data, which is like the inverse of what's being stated here. Is sometimes funny because if someone purchases a license from someone else to obtain some data, they actually receive a digital copy of that data. So it's not like I'm handing over something like a token, which cannot be like double spent. Like the data is just copied. But the fact of the matter is that people don't, or companies in general, don't want to use this type of systems like IPFS, like content-addressable systems, just because it would allow people to like maintain that copy forever. So by handing out a license and revoking that license again, it's a silly concept, but it switches, like it gets some sort of a switch in the user's mind or the purchaser of that license, that once he loses that license, he also mentally loses access to the data, while physically he still has that data because he still owns a copy. And so I think that's an interesting aspect of how people look at let's say the availability of data. It's not because the data physically or like technically is available that you also have at all times the perception that the data is actually accessible, because you don't feel entitled anymore that you can still access the data because like your license is expired to that data sort of. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a silly thing, but it applies in how you implement the distribution of immutable data, I think. So if you use these systems, it's very difficult, or it becomes very difficult for people to actually use licensing schemes anymore. So like I'm a proponent for this thing, of course. But that was just like one of the things reading through it. Like jumped to my mind that this is something that a lot of people who are like trying to monetize access to data just don't want to see, right?
Anyone can comment. I totally agree with you that, and for me, immutable data, especially immutable data that's been agreed to on a public network like Ethereum or any of the public blockchains, has already been owned or created by the entire community. The whole community is creating this data, and we're paying for it, I think, through if I'm a holder of a coin in a blockchain, the block reward that happens at every block is effectively lowering my value of that coin. That's inflation of the coin. And I think of that as me paying for the creation of the data that we're securing with that blockchain. So why am I going to have to pay for it again? And that's kind of where I come from, that we've already paid for it, we all own it already, and everybody should be able to get it freely, because I want us all to build applications in John Nash's world, not in a world where we don't trust each other. That's where I'm coming from. Did anyone else have any other things that struck them or they found?
Yeah, I have one that for me it's, I think, yeah, of course. There is one that says, let me see if I see it. Let me see. Software solutions are either fully decentralized from the start or never will be. I'm just absolutely against that sentence. At least at the stage that we are right now. So, security, and here we come again to the security issues, and I think that the DAO is a good example on that. For me, I think decentralization is a path. First, I don't understand decentralization as a binary thing. It's something that it is or is not. Decentralization is a gradient. It's like a path. It's like the freedom. Freedom is not you are free or you are not. You are more free or you are less free. So decentralization is a little bit the same. The concept is like you go through decentralization. You go to the path to decentralization. And in general, well, you can talk about, but systems that are more progressive, that goes in the one direction, I believe that they have more chances to succeed and to become than not changes that needs to just break everything and change on the stuff. Here, for example, in the DAO is we think so. For example, having systems that are quite centralized at the beginning, while they are securing and getting more secure, just testing that the system works, and then having a path to being every time more decentralized. I think it's possible. Of course, it's an opinion, okay? But I think it's possible, and I think it's a better path and a more optimal path than Ethereum by itself. Ethereum, for example, has a lot of criticism that's centralized. I think that we fully agree that if we compare the decentralization of Ethereum at Bitcoin, it's much more decentralized Bitcoin than Ethereum at this stage. But at this point, I see, or at least until now, Ethereum have also evolved. We have tested a lot of technologies that we can advance more, much. So we tested a lot of things and we improve it. We research it. We get a better technology in this path. You need to. That doesn't mean that at some point you don't. So at the end goal, you don't need to lose what's the end goal, and you need to define and very clearly define that you are going to be decentralized, and you have to put the mechanism in the governance, in the smart contracts, just at the start to this path. But in the early stages, I think is a better strategy. I'm talking about the strategy to start in a more centralized matter, especially in a stage where we don't even know, that we don't have even knowledge on that.
So I'll just read another one of these mantras. It says, so that one was about, I said, software solutions are either fully decentralized from the start or they never will be. And there's another one here that says, let me find it for a second. Yeah, where is that one at? I should have numbered these. Oh, here it is. This is another one. The path from centralization to decentralization is not a slider, it's an on-off switch. So those two things kind of go together. Jordi is on a different side. I'm not even sure I'm on my side, to be perfectly honest. In a practical world, I think that it's probably true that you have to go through this centralization place. I think it's I think it's really interesting to go all the way to decentralization on purpose from the beginning, so that you can explore what it looks like out there, and then you can come back and help people get down that path. So let's stay on that subject for a little while. Does anyone else have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of this node, in my opinion, or at least how it was designed, was to point out how ever decentralized we think we are, the infrastructure that we're working with is completely so you go ahead and build a decentralized piece of code, but then have some giant telco cut your access to the internet, right? And so wow, it was super uncensorable, right? Oh wait, no, unless you're in Spain and Telefonica doesn't like what you're doing, or the government doesn't like what you're doing. Or you're using someone else's server. You don't have a server in your house. You don't control your data. No matter what you're doing right now in the world that we have today, you can't be fully decentralized. And obviously, Jordi and I have played these games with pushing the limits of decentralization, and it's exploded in our face. And so and maybe me more than him. I think it's been mentioned a couple times. There was this DAO thing, but if we start off with a path built in, if there is, we worked on this awesome product called the Vault, which right now is the Giveth bridge, which has a security guard, an owner, a time delay, right? It has all these security features. We even added recently a dead man switch, so that this awesome guy Bowen every day has to push a button, otherwise money can't come out, right? But that can be automated away. We built in, when designing these centralization features, there's for security, we built in a way for them to be removed. The design is that eventually, once we trust the rest of the code base, we can decentralize the holding of the funds. But right now, I don't even know if we fully trust the Solidity compiler. We're in such early stages that it's sort of reckless to go full decentralization. And the only reason people do it is because they're worried about legal shit, right? They want to avoid a lot of the laws that would say, oh, you're stewarding these funds, and that means that you need to apply for licenses, or SEC will put you in jail.
So I mentioned the DAO as a glorious example of code, not to bring up anything negative, but I understand completely what you're saying, and we live in a practical world. So I unfortunately, maybe I live in a world 25, 30 years from now where we are all running our own nodes, and we're all extracting the data directly for ourselves, and the telephone systems can't censor us and so forth. So I like living out there just to think about these things in this way, and I totally understand there's practical problems with it.
No, I couldn't agree more. And Jordi even qualified his statement with that exact thing. For now, right now, we can't do full decentralization. Even though this node is called Decentralize Now, it's it's almost like one of these phrases. It's really just to bring up the point. Let's be aware, where we really are.
My name is Stefan Boyne. Yeah. So I just wanted to point out also the fact that I think all of us sitting here, we've been thinking about decentralization and all these concepts and the potential risks of centralization and all that. But I think we must not forget that for people who haven't been in that thought process all that much, it takes some time to sort of wrap your head around a lot of these concepts. And in that sense, I think it's a far stretch to expect from anybody who hasn't spent a lot of time thinking about all these concepts to immediately get on that train and then say okay, let's go full decentralization, because it's not only a practical thing, just a lot of infrastructure still needs to be built and so forth, a lot of software needs to be improved, but also the minds of people need to change, and that also will take a lot of time. So in that sense, I would also argue that the decentralization part is more like a slider thing, it's a gradual thing where people also have to sort of be given the time to wrap their head around it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I agree with. I'm thinking more in the context of data, right? Which I think is the data, and And definitely, I am of the opinion that decentralization is more like a trend or like a path, a philosophy to follow, than kind of an objective that can be achievable. That's the way I see it always, and we have to be pragmatic. In regards to what is data and knowledge, um, um, the fact is that as we are not prepared, or we are not culturally, to this decentralization of knowledge and information. And in fact, it's something that already started when it started in the 80s or in the 70s even. There were some philosophers, you might have heard of Ortega. Some of the disciples were studying what would be the impact of electronics. They would say computers, because there were no computers. So what is the impact of electronics? And they were very concerned with the fact that there will be centralization or more centralization of knowledge and information as a result. And that we will normally blindly accept that rather than questioning that. So we are really against a trend that is beyond our own efforts of each of us. Have to be aware of the risk of centralization of content and knowledge, and it's something that has only just started, and we see how massive it is. So I invite you to read those things for the disciples of Ortega, like I said, talking about information and the risks of electronics, because it was really, really focused on what will happen with this, is that there will be a trend to centralization of knowledge and information, that we should fight to maintain our own freedom. That was at the stake as a result of that.
I completely agree, and I was involved, not heavily, but in the early internet, back when the internet first came out, and one of the very early things that people were talking about when servers, internet, web servers came out, was that everyone can run a web server and serve their own content to every other person. And that didn't happen because the software requirements were heavier than the hardware capabilities. So the software moved to these gigantic servers, and we have this hugely centralized world now. And my concern, if we're not careful, is we're creating exactly the same dynamic, so that 35, 40 years from now, the only people that can extract the data from these unbelievably complicated blockchains is going to be big, giant companies with hundreds of employees churning on the data constantly. And I see that as a worse outcome than just staying with Web 2.0, or let's go back to Web 1.0, if we're going to just centralize worse than we ever did before. And that's part of my concern as well.
Yeah, the one that kind of struck me that I just wanted to read again was scaling up from decentralized to centralized is easier than scaling down from centralized to decentralized. And it just makes me think about, how our team at DAppNode has kind of been like navigating these waters, how we're gonna keep working together, and how we can effectively communicate the strategy that we're working on for the most effective way for us to stay aligned. And it's from a communication standpoint, from a trust standpoint, being decentralized is super hard. So it makes you think about how when you have a decentralized team of people who are really truly decentralized and they're contributing code in a way that's fluid and natural and that aligns, they don't really need to create this rigid structure, right? It's fluid. But then if you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, we're scaling up to centralized, so we're taking it to the next level, we're gonna like go after the next big thing, it's almost like stepping back into a place where actually what you're doing is it's like it's hard to explain. Yeah, it's hard to explain. So that thing really struck me, and it made me think about how from how we can work better together is really about stepping back and staying in communication, staying in touch, and making sure that we're always aligned with what we're building and the direction that we're going.
Yeah, I think to stay decentralized as a team, you really something we didn't do very well in Giveth, in my opinion, actually, is building value statements and how do you stay aligned if you don't define what you're doing and how, the values and the way that you're going to do it. It takes a lot of work to build in decentralization into your community. I mean, it's so easy. All the tools are built around centralizing, right? Like even GitHub. GitHub was down a couple days ago, right? I mean, that's the main thing we use to be decentralized. Everything is on GitHub, and Microsoft owns it, and it goes down for 6 hours. Like, this is crazy. And if you have a GitHub, who merges pull requests? It's definitely not a DAO, okay? There's no DAOs merging pull requests. We're working on it. There's a group called Pando. Really cool. But it's centralized.
Just a couple of words on decentralized teams. Just by itself, building a team is challenging by itself, even if the team is absolutely centralized. This is very, very, very challenging. It's not easy, and a lot of the times at least fails. So that's the first thing. That building a team that's decentralized, it's like double challenging at least. So that's something that we need to be aware. We don't know, and of course we need to learn a lot in how to work in decentralized teams. One of the things that I've seen, and I think that the people confuse us in decentralization, when we talk about decentralization, means mainly that sometimes it's the lack of centralization or it's the lack of power. But it's not the lack of power. That means that the power is in the peers, is in the people in the same manner. And power, I would say, is almost a synonym of responsibility. Okay, that means that the same way that the central power without responsibility doesn't work, if we transfer this power to the peers, and these peers have not the responsibility, it's not going to work neither. Okay, so I think that's important that we are aware that when we are in a decentralized team, all of us, have the power, means have the responsibility for the team to work on. And the other thing that I think that also confuses a lot is the decentralization in none of the case means the lack of leadership. Sometimes people think that decentralization is, okay, everybody do whatever they want, and then it will work just by magic art, and well, sometimes there is magic, and sometimes maybe something works, but in general, it doesn't work. Okay, so the leadership is one role, like many other roles that in a team somebody needs to play on. And the facilitator, there are many roles in a normal team theory that they needs to be there. If they are not there, the team will not work, and that happens in centralized and decentralized team. So that's for me the at least some views on that.
Yeah, so I really appreciate what you say about there's going to be a leader, decentralized or not, there's going to be a leader. And the issue is power. And the issue is, what type of power does that leader have? Does that leader have power that has been agreed to? And I'm talking now about, in specific, a smart contract, that the power that the leader has been agreed to beforehand by all the participants. And can the participants conclude that the power that the leader is using, he's using in a way that they've previously agreed to? So one of the things I say here is owner is a mistake. So I say that because a lot of people just put is owner in the smart contract, and what that means is that the owner can do pretty much anything they want, sort of including upgrading the software to brand new version of the software, which to me completely eliminates the control on the power that that leader has, so that the community, I think, doesn't really form to the extent that it could form if the power was very specifically controlled in that smart contract. So I agree with you completely that all of these things are difficult and very impossible, but we should be careful and thoughtful about just adding the ability to upgrade a smart contract, because to me that doesn't really live in the world that I want to live in, which is John Nash's world, instead of that guy that doesn't trust anybody.
Just let me disagree a little bit with you. It's but the world is about evolution, okay, and adapting to new circumstances and adapting to the future. So I would just say the opposite that says. So any organization that has not the ability of upgrading itself is a dead organization, especially if you are in crypto or in technology in those days. But that's so I think, and I know where you are going. So it's no, I know that you are meaning. Other thing, and I think is where you are going is how, because this is where most of the tricks are in the governance, and we are going to the governance of a decentralized manner, is how this upgradability should be done. Okay, and then we go to exactly the same point, is where how the decisions should be made in a decentral manner, or if you want, what's the governance of a decentralized structure should be. But if we accept that we have a decentralized governance, as part of the governance, upgrading or having some levels of upgrading, I think that's a must. I would not understand. So for me, it's difficult to think in any organization, at least any human organization, that does not have a form of improvement, of upgradability, even in their own rules or in their own governance. That would mean that you don't accept that you can be wrong.
As far as my mantras compared to the audience, I think I'm about not 0 for 9 so far. So does anyone have? Oh, one. Oh, okay. Okay. Good. All right. Oh, sure.
Yeah, I have to disagree with you. Really, again, I really think that there is something that businesses need to evolve, and that there are things that is called a business logic, that is the own business of the own logic of a business, that is the one by the means that an organization can survive and needs to be adaptive and needs to evolve. And therefore, it shouldn't be put in a smart contract and in Ethereum. That's my point. So what I think, as far as we don't have yet a culture of values that are pretty much aligned, where we say an escrow contract is this kind of contract, and because we all agree we don't need to create another escrow contract, when we'll start having those building blocks that we can play for to build the business logic of an organization, we need to continue experimenting with this. But those basic layers of values that can be implemented in code, as soon as they become values that are generally acceptable, they have a place in the blockchain. So what I mean when I say things like what I'm seeing, like all these proxy contracts to be able to access something that you can change, really banks my mind. It's like, okay, sorry, this was not supposed to be like that. Still, it's very interesting. It is very interesting, but I'm still, in fail of something more like these libraries that will do the mathematics, and everybody agrees that 1 + 1 is 2, and if it is 256 + 1 is 1. These kind of things that we agree and that we have it as values. And as soon as nobody understands that 256 + 1 is 1, then we shouldn't use that operator. Then we need to have this thing that translates something that is miserably failing in the design to match with what we understand ourselves as values. Therefore, so I think that these things still need to be settled at the grounds. Play with it, but recognizing that is not the end state. So it's we are still learning, and this is still pretty much an experiment, and will make us understand better what this is good for. But so far, its owner is a mistake.
Yeah, or at least, and this is, I think I also agree. So at least when you see its owner in a contract, at least all alarms should raise it, at least. So that's the alarms should trigger.
So there's different kinds of is owner. There's is owner who can simply just change everything. There's is owner who's restricted by governance. Is what we're. Let me touch on something that's near and dear to my heart. I say break out of the browser but stay behind the node. There's a big wide desktop out there. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Do we have to write everything we do inside of a browser forever, or can we go back to developing desktop software that interacts directly with the node and just presents a native interface on a desktop? Is that even close to reasonable? You're not allowed to talk. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
It's like I just wanted to do a joke. I just wanted to do a joke. It's like I think that we just forget that we should forget the. It's just a joke, eh? But we just forget to writing desktop applications, and we just write machine, assembly machine without operating system applications.
That would suit me perfectly. I would love to write command line interface is what I'm talking about. So does anyone else? I grew up in a day prior to the browser even existing, so a desktop application is wonderful for me, but I think a lot of people, they grew up in a browser and they can't even imagine an application that's not inside of a browser. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think you're seeing a huge movement towards that actually in the Ethereum space. My crypto, and even Ledger, actually Ledger's the other way, right? They moved back into the browser. And so but for the most part, if you want native security, people don't trust the browser very much anymore. And it's a scary place to work when you're dealing with a wallet, especially. And so I think it makes a lot of sense, but it's another piece though is that the user experience in the browser is just so much better. User's already there. It's smooth. They just go right in. Having that extra leap of downloading this onto your computer, which is a little scary as well, is really hard. So there's this other side of it where the user experience is so important that sometimes you make these compromises.
The middle ground is this new progressive web apps that, you have a web app, but then on your phone they act natively. So I would imagine that would come to the desktop as well, if I'm not mistaken. The fact that I could have a...
What are the examples of that?
So, for example, if you go to twitter.com on your mobile, certain Androids recognize that you can make that as a shortcut to the desktop, and then it acts like a native app, but it is a progressive web app. And so you have companies like the Microsoft Store and the Android Store who just scan websites for progressive web apps and add them to the App Store, and they behave like native apps, but they are inherently web apps.
So one of the yeah. So one of the things that I look at, the reason why I might want to be on a desktop application is because, for example, if I want to communicate without letting anyone know that I've communicated, I can encrypt the entire communication prior to injecting it into the node, and then my friend on the other side of the world can extract that and decrypt it outside of the node so that I have a private communication with my friend. That, to me, if I'm in the browser, it feels a little more difficult, but I don't know enough about a browser, so we'll just say that. Did anyone else have any other thing to say?
Yeah, so in my opinion, or to my observation, I think there are two different reasons for either going to the browser and returning back from the browser to more like desktop apps or even hardware stuff. It's just where all the tools are, right? So if you want to build a rich user experience, for example, it's better to go to a higher level language and to a place where there are you just can compose, mix and compose whatever's available in the open source space mostly. So if I wanna build a rich user interface, I'll naturally go towards a browser because all the ready-made tools are there. It's very easy to do that. And on the other hand, you have the requirement of security, where because it's so open and at such a high level of on the language level, there's so many levels where it can go wrong security-wise. So I mean that's the tendency to go back down to the hardware sort of. So I just think it depends on the use case that you're trying. What problem are you trying to solve? Yeah, and to wrap up that thought for me is that I think it's just not feasible to go too low level again if you want to build a rich user interface, because like the technology is evolving so fast that by the time you can push out the desktop software, probably the underlying technology is also already obsolete.
So actually that thought has to wrap up this session. Thank you so much, Jay. That was really good. Let's have a... Yeah, thank you so much. The next session is actually Solidity practice. So it's James and the Code Together crew, Adrian and Jeff and a few other people are here to show you how to work with Solidity, and it doesn't matter what your level is. If you don't even know how to spell Solidity, that's totally okay. You know, they have tools for you, and if you're already pretty well practiced but you want to get better and figure out some cool tricks, they have answers for you there too. If you want to take this away, I need some help grabbing tables. You want some tables, right? Oh yeah?
Maybe tables? Why not? Yeah, let's grab a couple and then see. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I might just wait 5 more minutes and then we can get started.